Hello everyone, welcome back. Get comfortable, relax, and enjoy today's exciting fanfic. Now, let's begin part 1. Naruto POV 6 years after the Kyuubi attack. Get back here, you damn demon. Give me my son back. You killed my wife. I rounded the alley and tried to pick the pace up. I felt blood running down my head. I felt the bruises on my sides and my arms I got before I got away. I heard the yelling of the villagers getting a little farther away as I turned again and stopped, seeing a wall with a half-broken ladder. I looked around, trying to find something or somewhere to hide. Kid, you're light enough to get up the ladder. I didn't care where the voice came from as I ran over to the broken ladder. I started it as the villagers came around the corner. Get down here. The ladder got jerked around, and I held tight to the side of the ladder before I heard the metal snap. I looked back down and saw the ladder had broken. It fell back into the crowd, and I sighed before I started up again. Kid, you got real lucky. I sighed and then started to walk along the rooftop. Why is it always like this on my birthday? I stopped at the roof's edge and looked over, seeing that the ground was too far and I couldn't reach the other roof. Hey, kid, why were they chasing you? I looked back and stopped, seeing a man sitting in the shadow of another building. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could tell he was looking right at me. I don't know. They do this on my birthday every year. He hummed as he looked at me. Then, he lifted his arm, and he had a bottle in his hand. He took a long drink from the bottle and sighed before he threw it over the side of the building. I heard it break and a man scream. What is your name, kid? Naruto Uzumaki. He shot up, and I saw he was huge. He was bigger than anyone I'd ever seen. You're Naruto Uzumaki. I jumped, scared, as I looked up at him. Why, yeah. He walked out of the shadows. He was tanned with dark red hair with a little gray on the top. He had on a long, sleeveless, high-collared black cape. Under that, he had on a white shirt half buttoned up, exposing the middle of his chest and some abs like shinobi. He wore a set baggier pair of pants with a green-yellow, indiscernible floral pattern halfway up the shin. The pair was a slightly loose, plain brown one with golden buttons down the outer leg sides and a red sash around his waist to keep his shirt tucked inside. But his eyes were so strange. They had a small black dot in the center with a black ring around the center. And he had 3 scars going down his left eye. Naruto, how old are you? He moved closer, and I saw he only had 1 arm. 6. Why? He made a fist and clenched his teeth before looking to the Hokage's tower. I see. Just you wait, Hiruzen. He growled out Gigi's name, and I felt something go by me, a chill ran through me. He sighed before he unclenched his fist before he looked back at me with a smile. Well, Naruto, I think I can tell you something that will make you happy. I blinked as I looked at him. What is that? He smiled as he walked over and knelt to be level with me. My name is Shanks Uzumaki, former head elder of Uzushiogakure. I may be your grandfather and we're going to see the Hokage. Council room POV 10 minutes later. Hiruzen sat in his seat listening to the elders trying to get him to allow them access to the Namikaze fortunes. As he was about to tell them no again, a power he hadn't felt in decades filled the air. Danzo and the elders and Hiruzen himself jumped up, knowing only one man who knew the secrets of that power. Hiruzen. Hiruzen looked over at Homura as he shook with fear. Anbu. A dozen Anbu appeared in the council room and bowed to their Hokage. Lock down the village, a beast far worse than the Kyuubi is NEA. The council room door was blown in with the 4 Anbu guarding the room flying in with the doors. The Anbu crashed into the walls behind the elders, making them fall to the ground out of fear. Dust floated in the air as a figure slowly started to walk onto the wooden floor, and the walls made an echo as the figure walked in a sword sheath, tapping the ground as he walked. The new Chunin and Tokubetsu Jonin and a few Anbu in the room started falling to the floor. Long time no see, Hiruzen. I've come for answers. A man in a long black cape walked through the dust with a blonde boy being held in his one arm. He stopped in the center of the room and Hiruzen finally saw that it was a sleeping Naruto being held by the arm of the former elder of Uzushiogakure. The clan heads looked at the man, all of them seemed to shake at the sight of the man. Lord Hokage, who is this man? Sume asked as she looked up at the huge alpha of an elderly man. Shanks looked over at her and she shut her mouth as he glared at her. Sit down and be quiet before I sit you down. Assume normally the most feral woman of Konoha as looking like a whipped puppy. Shanks looked back at Hiruzen. The glare Shanks leveled at Hiruzen could make a man's soul shake. I want to know what happened to my daughter Hiruzen. Where is Kushina and her husband Minato? Hiruzen turned ghostly white as he looked at the most powerful Uzumaki he'd ever known. All the clan heads looked at the man and then back at Hiruzen. Lord Hokage, what is he talking about? Danzo spoke before Hiruzen could. The Crimson Beast of Uzushiogakure, the last user of an ancient bloodline of the Uzumaki clan. Shock filled the room as they looked at Naruto as held onto the man's cape. Forget that for now, I want to know if this boy is my grandson. A vein appeared on his head as he looked at Hiruzen. And who am I going to kill for letting the villagers attack him every damn day? The floor around him shattered at his yell, the window blew out and the Anbu who'd surrounded him all passed out from the power he let loose. The civilian council members who were too scared to speak passed out as well. The ninja council nearly passed out from his power. Lord Shanks, I'm sorry but I can't tell you Hiruzen, if you don't answer my questions I'll destroy the security seal barrier around the village. And as the former elder of Uzushiogakure, I will take all the seals and scrolls my daughter brought from our homeland. Hiruzen shrank back as he looked at one of the few men he feared. She and Minato are dead, Shanks, and yes, Naruto is your grandson. But, you have to let me explain. Hiruzen tried to retake control but stopped as he looked into Shanks' eyes. I see. Well, my grandson has told me everything on the way here. He wanted to be a shinobi. As for explanation, I could care less. You will have someone to take me to my daughter's home. I know you knew my daughter was a seal master as well, it's still standing. After that and the beating you all have coming I will start his training myself. But, Shanks looked over at Danzo making him freeze. The old war hawk was no fool. He knew that even if he used his root and Shisui Sharingan he'd only just hold the man off. All of Konoha's ninjas knew the Sharingan was useless against a seal master. I know all about that beast, I can sense it, you old bastard. My grandson will not be made into a damn weapon or keep being a damn punching bag. As of this moment anyone who so much as touches him without his okay dies. Danzo sweated as he looked at the man he knew could tear the village apart if he wanted to. Oh, I also noticed something when I saw him running from them. Some of your shinobi were in the crowd. If I see that again, well, you can guess right. Everyone nodded before a dog-masked Anub appeared beside Hiruzen. Lord Hokage, a group of 40 ninjas were found dead right outside of the tower. A second later the dog-masked Anbu was slammed with the same power everyone else was. He didn't pass out but was brought to the ground. I guess that one has a bit of willpower. To withstand my weak haki is impressive. He'll do for a guide. We'll be waiting outside, and I will be coming as I have about 90% or so of the valuables from our old home. I'll be coming to exchange it for the Ryo it's worth. My grandson is done digging through trash for food and clothes. Hiruzen nodded knowing he'd lost his chance to get a word in. Naruto's POV 2 days later. Gramps, this is incredible. I looked back at my grandfather and saw him sitting on the porch of our new house. A smile on his face. That's nice, Naruto. Don't forget we're going to get you more clothes later as well as training gear and a few swords. I'll be teaching you the Crimson Beast style of swordsmanship I use. Really, Gramps? He smiled wide and nodded as he stood up and looked over to the gate. I looked over and saw the girl I helped when she was being bullied. I heard my grandfather laugh before he spoke up. Little miss, you're free to come onto the grounds. I'm sure my grandson would love the company. She epped before slowly coming out from behind the stone gate. HHHLOLLL Lord SSJ Hank A and N Naruto K-kun. I smiled then ran up to her and grabbed her hand. Well, you heard Gramps. Let's go play. We have a small stream and pond around back we can play in. I turned and started to pull her to the small forest behind the house. N Naruto-kun. I laughed as we ran through the trees. I smiled as we came up on the small clearing with the stream feeding into the pond. I looked at the flowers around the pond with a few rabbits on the other side of the pond. This is a pretty place, N Naruto-kun. I smiled and I let her hand go before I ran over to the stream and pulled my sandals off and rolled my pants legs up. I jumped into the water. I smiled, loving the cool feeling of the water. I heard some splashing behind me and I turned around and saw Hinata smiling at me. I grabbed her and pulled her up to the edge of the pond. I reached in and grabbed a few of the flat stones. Naruto-kun WW, what are we doing? I smiled and pulled one of the smaller rocks out. I got into the stance Gramps showed me for shuriken throwing. Gramps has started teaching me to throw shuriken and said he'd teach something to help me learn faster later today. That's nice. I laughed and threw it as hard as I could. It skipped 2 times before it splashed into the pond. Hinata took a stone from my hand and then did the same as me. She got 3 skips over the water before it splashed into the pond. Shanks Pav. I laughed as I watched Naruto drag the poor red-faced girl off into the small woods behind the house. I nodded my head before I sat back down. I know you 6 are there, come on out. A second later Hiruzen and 5 more Anbu appeared at the gate. I smiled as I looked at him. Hello, Shanks. I hope you know the hell you've thrown the village into. Forcing the announcement of Naruto's heritage has split the citizen and shinobi councils. Then there is the matter that you now have the funds equal to 5 years of the budget of the village. When we add in all the money and investment accounts your daughter and son-in-law had, you now control 2/3 of the economy. I smiled as I rested my arm on my thigh. Well, certainly not what I set out to do, but nice to know. So, my guess is the shinobi don't care too much about it, as it adds another shinobi clan, though upset the power of the civilian council had, right? Hiruzen sighed and nodded before walking over and sitting down beside me. Yes, they are upset that a new powerhouse is here and it's clear they nor the elders can force you into compliance. So they are trying to convince me to have Naruto married to one of their daughters or to put in the CRA when he'd 15. I huffed and nodded my head. I would like my grandson to marry the same as me and my daughter did. But if not, I will see to it if he finds good women to marry if he wants to be in the CRA. Well, I may not like it, but it is his decision to make, but I will make it clear to him that he is to love and respect those women. Hiruzen nodded, seemingly happy with my words. Well, do you need anything? I smiled, then held my hand out. I want the shadow clone jutsu. You and I both know her has the reserves for the jutsu, plus it will help me teach him our clan's jutsu, fuinjutsu, and if he can use it, the Othaki powers. Hiruzen looked at me, worry on his face. Can you? Hiruzen, I'm the last master known to use haki. I think I know when someone has that power. But, I'm surprised you didn't notice it, Hiruzen. He can sense emotions near perfectly and seem to be, at least to sense or well aware of other presences. To think at his age he's able to do that. It's an incredible experience to see someone so young to have that level of haki without knowing anything about it. I see. Well, can I ask if he has those powers as well? I hummed as I looked back at the forest. I don't know. But, one thing I am sure is that he'll become extremely powerful, maybe more so than you and me. Shanks Pav. I smiled as I looked down at my grandson as he walked beside me with a look I loved. He had tried his old blue shorts and torn up shirt. He now wore a pair of black jeans with a shirt like mine and a blue sash around his waist. He had sandals, like mine, with a long black coat on his shoulder. Tied on his back was a fine set of twin katanas. They were larger than he was at the moment, but he'd grow into them. Hey Gramps. Yeah. Naruto stopped and then looked up at me with a worried look on his face. I know, I sense them too. Don't worry, if they try something, I will deal with them. He nodded before he turned around, and I looked back and saw Hinata running after a small laughing girl. Hanabi. Naruto ran off to help catch the little girl. I laughed and turned to watch them try and fail to. She slipped by them and came running right towards me. I laughed as I kneeled down, setting my clay sake jug down, and grabbed the little girl as she tried to run by me. She laughed as she grabbed onto my arm. I laughed as I sat down on the street as Hinata and Naruto rushed over with a few Hyuga clan members came running up. Lady Hinata. Lady Hanabi. I laughed as Hanani grabbed onto my open shirt. She stomped her feet on the ground as she laughed up at me. I smiled down at her as she pulled on my shirt and tried to climb over my legs, and reached for my sword. I patted her little head as the 2 clan members approached me. Lady Hanabi, please leave Lord Shanks alone. I laughed as I wrapped my arm around her and stood up. Naruto grabbed my sake. I needed to talk with Lord Hiashi soon anyways. The 2 clan members stiffed as they looked up at me. The little girl grabbed onto my collar and laughed as she kicked her legs. Do you two think he and the elder could spare the time? They sweated as they looked at me. Why yes, Lord Shanks. I laughed as Naruto grabbed the sake jug, slung it over his shoulder, and grabbed Hinata's hand. She turned red, and I laughed as we started to follow the two clan members. Hanabi seemed to be claiming down as she sat on my arm and rested her head on my shoulder as she held onto my cape collar. I looked at Naruto and Hinata out of my eyes and smiled. A new couple may be coming soon. Naruto Pav. I smiled as I walked with Hinata's hand in mine. I looked at her, and she looked away, her face all red. I stopped making her stop as well. I set the sake jug down and then put a hand on her head. Do you feel sick, Hinata-chan? Her face reddened before steam came out of her mouth and started falling over. I grabbed her and noticed my Gramps and the two clan members circling around us. Is Lady Hinata okay? I shrugged as I picked her up in my arms as best I could and grabbed the sake jug. Wow, she's real light. I nodded and started to walk again. She's a little warm, but it is hot out today. Maybe she got overheated. Gramps laughed a little, then started to walk again. We best get this lady's home then, Naruto. Oh, and if you drop here when we get home, I'm throwing you into the pond again. I gulped, not wanting to be thrown into the pond again, the water was so cold. Yes, sir. I held Hinata tighter, and she rested her head on my shoulder and grabbed a hold of my shirt. She must cling to things in her sleep. I smiled for some strange reason. I like this. I'll have to ask Gramps about this when we get to the Hyuga clan compound. Naruto. I looked up and smiled, seeing Gramps as he stopped again. Yeah, Gramps. He smiled as he looked at me. When we get them home, you be on your best behavior. This will be the first time you will be in a formal setting, so behave. I nodded as we got going again. Thankfully, we weren't too far from her home. We walked up, and the two clan members quickly ran up to the guards. They spoke as we walked up to them. One quickly ran off, and we were led into the clan compound. Lord Shanks-sama, welcome to our home. I looked over and saw a woman who looked a lot like Hinata. Her hair was much longer and a slightly lighter shade. She had on a white kimono and had a sweet smile on her face. Lady Hinoka. I looked up at the other guard as he bowed to the lady. I quickly followed, doing my best to hold Hinata up as Gramps bowed to her. She laughed into her hand before she gave us a small bow back before taking Hanabi and holding her in her arms. Hinoka Heim. I looked back and saw Hiyashi coming quickly with the guard. He looked at us and started to look angry as he looked right at me. I stepped back before my Gramps stepped in front of us, blocking us from him. Calm down, Lord Hiyashi. Naruto is carrying her because she passed out from the heat. I guess she was training before she ran off after her sister. I watched as the ordinarily emotionless Hiyashi seemed to show some fear as he looked at Gramps. I felt a little relief as Hiyashi backed down some. Yes, she was, and I guess she could have overheated. But, I do wish my clan's branch members had done their jobs. I laughed as Hinata slowly started to move around. I looked down at her as Gramps talked with the Hiyashi. She moved closer to my chest, and she sighed as she pulled on my shirt some. I smiled and looked up at Hana. Hinoka-sama, do you think we could get her to a bed? She smiled and nodded as she waved for me to follow her. I did, and we walked off, leaving Gramps to deal with Hiyashi. You know, you and Hinata sure look cute like that. I felt my face heat up as we walked through the homes. Hinata was making little movements in my arms, made it a little hard to keep her in my arms. My right hand is still holding the rope around the sake jug. So, you're this Naruto-kun my daughter has been talking about all this time. I'd like to say thanks for saving her from her bullies. I noticed something. She was a beautiful lady with her hair and the size of her chest, which Hanabi was making more visible. Hanabi pulled her kimono over some, and I could see her bar and some skin. I felt my face head up more, and I looked away from her. Oh, your red face is cute. I looked down at Hinata and stopped as I locked eyes with her. She turned red, and before I could say anything, she fainted again. Haha, a cute couple if I've ever seen one. By the way, we're here. I looked up and saw we were at a huge house. It was a little bigger than mine and Gramps' house, but we had a forest around ours. I followed her in and did my best to show manners like Gramps told me. You can take her to the living room. The second door on the right, and feel free to wait while I get drinks. I nodded and gave her the best bow I could. I quickly walked to the door, happy to get her weight out of my arms. No matter how light she was, my arms were burning. I walked past a few maids, and they bowed to me as I walked. One smiled at me before she opened the door for me. "Welcome, young master." I blushed and bowed before standing back up. "Thank you, miss." She smiled, and I walked into the living room. I walked over to the couch and tried to lay her down. She clung to my shirt and sighed, knowing her grip was really tight. I kneeled down as best I could with her weight. I dropped the jug and smiled, glad Gramps' sake was okay now. I got onto the couch and laid Hinata on the couch beside me, but half her body was still on me. "Naruto-kun." I jumped, hearing her say my name before she pulled herself to my side more. She rested her head on my thigh, and I smiled again before I rested my arm over her back and held her closer. "Damn Naruto, you got game already." I stiffed and slowly turned my head, seeing Gramps smiling wide with Hiashi and Hinoka beside him. Hiashi looked ready to rip me apart, but Hinoka smiled as she looked at me. I laughed before pulling my arm off her, hoping Gramps would stop Hiashi again. "Naruto, you know taking a lady the first time you bring her home is so forward." Gramps laughed as I felt my face heat up again. I growled before I reached up to grab one of my swords. Hiashi looked surprised, and Gramps laughed before he waved his hand. Okay, I had my fun. Now, let's get you free, we need to go talk with Sir Hiashi." He and Hinoka walked over, and Hinoka pulled her hands from my shirt. Gramps wrapped his arm around my chest and picked me up, then sat me back on my feet. I nodded before Hinoka held up Gramps' sake. "Thank you, Lady Hinoka." She smiled and gave us a small bow before Gramps turned, and he started to walk out of the room. He followed behind Hiashi as he opened the door across the hall. I followed them into the room and looked around the new room. It was like we walked into a hall where another man with a woman was beside him. They looked at us, and I smiled and waved to them before I remembered to bow. When I stood back up, the man had a slight smirk, and the woman gave me a small smile and waved back. "Mother, father, thank you for coming so quickly." Hiashi bowed to his parents before taking a seat between them, and we sat down in front of them. I watched Gramps pull his sword off his side, then seat it down to his right side. I was confused. He didn't have an arm on that side, so why? I did as he did, took my swords off my back, and set them down on my left. "Now, as I told you, Lord Hiashi, Hinata has a great skill level for her age, and you're right, she does need more confidence. But I believe I know how to help her." "How so?" "My granddaughter is afraid to fight." Gramps nodded as he looked at them. "No, it's not fear, my daughter was like her when she was young." "Your daughter?" the elder Hyuga asked, and I looked away from them. Gramps sighed before I felt him putting his hand on my head. "You'd know her as Konoha's Red Death or the Red Hot Habanero." "You mean Kushina?" "Yes, she was my daughter." "Didn't Sir Hiashi not explain what happened in the council meeting?" Naruto-kun." I looked back and saw Hinata standing in the doorway. "Shanks Pav." I smiled as I looked back at Naruto's little lady. "Haha, Naruto, why don't you take your little lady and teach her the tree walking exercise? I thought you." "Okay, Gramps." He grabbed his swords and put them on his back again. He bowed to Hiashi and the two elders before he turned and walked over to the door. I smiled as Naruto took her hand again. I laughed a little as her face turned red and didn't faint this time. "Come on, Hinata-chan, I heard you Hyugas have really good chakra control. I'm sure you'll get this down fast." Her face got even redder, and I couldn't help but remember my wife Makino. I laughed, seeing what I knew was a future couple. Naruto pulled her away, making her follow him. Once the door closed, I turned back to look at the others. "You were saying, Sir Shanks? She's not afraid, she's gentle. She doesn't want to harm anyone while training. My grandson, like all Uzumaki, has a massive reserves of chakra. He had learned to make shadow close so she can learn the gentle fist that way. I can also work on making her reserves larger, as there is a secret that makes training easier." "And what is that?" I smiled before I looked over to the door again. "You three can come in. I know you're there." The door opened, and a little girl came running. I laughed as she jumped onto the side of my cloak. Hinoka walked in with a maid behind her. Hinoka took her seat next to Hiashi as Hanabi tried to climb up my right side. I laughed, then patted her head, making her laugh. She grabbed a hold of my hand and I led her around using my hand. Mommy, he's had hands feel like strange. Oh, you can talk, that's good to know. She smiled before sitting down on my right knee. I laughed as she leaned back into my side. It would seem the Hyuga heiress and her sister have taken a liking to the Uzumaki clan head and heir. I nodded before I looked back at the adults. Hinoka was laughing, and Hiashi looked at his mother with shock. I laughed before I cleared my throat before getting their attention back. Like I was saying, the secret is shadow clones. They have an ability not many know about. What is that? Hiashi seemed very interested. This jutsu allows the user to create one or more copies of themselves. A person's chakra is evenly divided between themselves and Thor clones. Creating one clone will give it half the user's chakra, creating two will give each a third of the user's chakra, and so on. Now, as for the secret, shadow clones useful for intelligence gathering. A shadow clone can be sent into hostile territory, gather information without endangering the user, and disperse when finished, thus transferring what they've learned. But dispersing too many at once can kill the user. That way this jutsu is forbidden. What? I looked at the shocked elder and laughed a little as I grabbed the sake jug. I know, it was shocking for me when I fought the first time. He learned to counter some of my attacks by using them. And Naruto can already use this jutsu. I nodded before I held the jug out to them. The elder smiled, seeing my little gift. What kind is this? Junmai Ginjio, I figured it'd be best to bring a gift. Hiashi and the elder smiled before Hiashi stood up and then grabbed the jug. You even got my preferred kind. Maybe letting her spend some time with you as a chakra trainer for a time each day would be smart. She's already finished her training for the day. I have 2 questions. I looked at the elder mother and nodded before patting Hanabi's head. She stood back up and walked over to her mother. Yes, miss. What would you like to know? She smiled as she looked at me. First, how many clones can Naruto-kun make, and can you teach that jutsu to Hinata? Well, Naruto can make 100 right now thanks to the massive chakra reserves we Uzumakis have. With that, many of our clan are born with Johan levels. And as far as I'm aware, your clan isn't known for large chakra reserves. I'd have to get her levels up before she learns this jutsu. Once she gets the tree walking down, her reserves will grow slowly. How long will it take to get her to a level where she can as the shadow clones? I hummed before nodding my head. If I can get them to water walking and teach them a few jutsu, their levels will increase over the next few weeks. But I won't have Naruto teach her the shadow clone jutsu until she has a high Chunin level. That sounds more than fair. Why don't you take her for the rest of the day? Okay, then should I get her dinner or should it bring her home for dinner? What were you going to make? I smiled as I stood up. I'm looking to hire a maid to start making food and help clean at home. I can still make anything, but it's a little troublesome, but doable. I could help with that. I blinked as I looked at Hinoka before she clapped her hand. A moment later, 2 maids came in, but I noticed their hands were a little rough, and they had a little more muscle than the other maids. I see, so you want to send maids that can fight. They jumped, and I laughed before walking over to them. I gave them a small bow. I thank you both for the help. So how does 80,000 yen a week sound? They gasped, and I smiled as I looked at them. I have more than enough to pay that, plus we have a private hot springs you and training grounds your families are free to use if you'd like. But that's more than 4 times what the main house pays us. I blinked as I looked at them. Really? In Uzushiogakure, that would be just the average pay. They smiled before they quickly bowed and rushed off, and I nodded my head before I looked back at the other. They looked shocked, and I waved before I noticed Hanabi dragging my sword across the floor. Little lady Hanabi. She jumped and looked up at me with the sweetest smile possible. I promise I was going to put it by the door. I laughed before I walked over and grabbed the sheath. Well, thanks for that, little lady. I slipped it under my sash before I patted her head. You're free to come along and watch them train if you want. Yeah. I laughed before she grabbed my hand and started to pull me along. Follow me. I smiled as I walked behind her. Yeah, just like old time. Naruto POV 3 weeks later. I smiled as I stood upside down from my branch and smiled over at Hinata as she did the same in the tree next to mine. I looked over at the pond and saw 20 of my clones and the 5 fighting Gramps on the water. Glad to see my control and chakra level have increased so much in the last few weeks. Naruto-kun. I turned my head back and saw he had a smile on her face, but it was still red. Ya Hinata-chan. She smiled before she jumped down to the ground and then waved for me to follow her. I followed her as she walked deeper into our small forest. I smiled, seeing her new clothes on. She had changed from her well-covering black training suit to a pair of pants with a small versus cut t-shirt. She walked up to a small blanket with a basket and a large apple juice bottle. I had MYUA and Emma set us a picnic lunch. I smiled, grabbed her, and pulled her over. She laughed a little. I was happy to see she was getting a little confidence now. Shanks Pav. I smiled as I looked down at the little couple from my tree. Well, the next few years are going to be interesting. Naruto Pav 2 years later. Ha! I dodged her gentle fist strike from the left, and she sent a blast of chakra into the water. I jumped back, missing a pair of clones fighting on the water with us. I landed next to the second pair we made, then rushed Hinata with my 2 wooden swords. I dashed through the 2 sets of clones as Hinata charged through the as well. I channeled my chakra into the wood as she got close. I swung the wooden swords hard, sending 2 chakra blades down at her. Soru. Hinata vanished, dodging the attack. She appeared beside me, and I knew what was coming. Hush so Ken wave. Soru. I jumped some move to dodge the attack, but I couldn't hold a candle with Hinata's control over Soru. I got a good 20 feet away before the shockwave opened the pond. Our clones kept fighting as the wave went under them. I sighed as the pond settled before Gramps called out. Okay you two, that's enough for today. Emma called out to us, and we dispelled our clones and walked off the water. So Hinata-chan, how do you think the clan meeting is going? Who knows Naruto-kun? But, now that we're 8 we're going to the academy soon. So, how did the council take it when your grandpa cashed in the other half of your clan's riches? I looked at her as she smirked. Oh, they lost it. Now we have enough money to live off of for over a decade. Danzo and the elders all but trying to kill him. But, we don't have to worry about that. We need to get our spare clothes and head over to the hot springs and get cleaned up. Right Naruto-kun. We walked over to the porch, and I was glad to see our clothes with some cut apples. We sat down, and Hinata sat beside me and leaned into my side. She rested her head on my shoulder and sighed as she started to eat a piece of apple. I smiled, then wrapped my arm around her. For some reason, Gramps just laughed off. I saw MYU and Emma looking at us from over their shoulders. My you two seemed like you're having fun. We jumped as Gramps walked out from around the house with a bag over his shoulder. Hey Gramps, what is with the bag? I thought I'd get you two gift as my way of showing you how proud of you two I am. To master all these skills before you were 10. Gramps walked over and kneeled in front of us. He opened the back, and we smiled, seeing the 2 wrapped bags from the clothes store that went looking in. I smiled as I ripped mine open and saw the knee-length orange cloak with our clan symbol on the back. At the bottom was a set of 3 black lines. I smiled as I took my black cloak off and put my new cloak on. Oh Cammy. I jumped as I looked at Hinata as she had an orange jack that looked like my cloak. But on the back of her jack was my clan's symbol with a smaller Hoiga clan symbol below our symbol. Hinata smiled, then hugged the jacket and looked at me. We match. I nodded and smiled as she quickly put the jacket on and smiled as she got up and ran around with it on. I smiled as I watched her as she ran around. Naruto. I blinked, then looked up at Gramps as he watched her run around. Ya Gramps. He looked down at me and smiled before sighing. I have to leave the village for a little while. The Hokage asked me to go and get an old friend Tsunade-chan, the best medic the village ever had. I shouldn't be gone for no more than a week at most. I nodded, glad that Gramps was finally taking an active role in the village. Old friend. Do you know her? Haha. Well, let's just say that me and her have a past. But, this time I don't think this time I'll get punched, but her because I got drunk. I looked at my Gramps as his cheeks turned red as he rubbed the back of his head. I hummed as I looked at him, then nodded my head as I stood up. Whatever Gramps, Just don't be stupid again. Oh, I stopped knowing that. Oh well. I took off at a run, knowing what was coming for me. Get back here, you Bart. Ignoring his yell, I ran over the water, not wanting to get thrown again. Soru. Gramps appeared before me and screamed as he raised a hockey-covered fist. I let myself fall into the water and kicked off the water hard with my chakra. I rocketed out of the other side of the pond and quickly used my chakra to dry my clothes as I jumped into the trees. Not bad, brat. I got grabbed on the head and slowly turned my head and saw Gramps smiling. Come on, Gramps, you know I was kidding. Gramps smiled as he moved his hand, grabbed my jacket, and slung me out of the trees into the pond. Shanks Pav. I laughed as I watched my grandson skip over the water before he splashed on the last hit. I watched as Hinata yelled his name before running onto the water to get out again. I smirked as I sat on the tree branch and watched Hinata slowly drag him out of the water. My little grandson, oh the hearts you'll break. Don't you think that was cruel? I smiled as I looked down at MYU. Maybe, but you got to admit it is cute to see Naruto with his head on Hinata's lap while out cold. True, and Our Lady has asked us to help those two out. I laughed as I rested my chin on my hand. I can't help but wonder what the future holds for those two. Still hoping he'll turn down the CRA when he's old enough. You know, he has started to gain the attention of a few other girls. One is the snake girl from the Dango stands. You know, the one after buying her a box to thank her for stopping those men who attacked him last week. The other is the young blonde girl he talks to when she and her father Inoichi when they come over with Lord Hiyashi for your poker nights. I jumped and laughed as I looked away from her. So you two know about that. Please don't tell Lady Hinoka or Inoichi's wife. They'd kill them when they know how much those two have lost to me. They'd come and kill me for taking a month's worth of budget from them. Oh, what do I get? I frowned and pulled a small stack of cash from a storage scroll on my sash side. I threw a small stack into her waiting hand. Haha, thank you, Sir Shanks. I huffed as I watched her walk off, counting the stack. I sighed as I watched her walk across the pond and saw Emma as she walked out with 2 bathing robes. Damn woman got me by the balls before I knew it. I sighed before I jumped down from the tree and walked across the pond. I walked past Hinata as she ran her hand over Naruto's hair. I laughed as I stopped to look at the two. Hinata looked up at me. Sir Shanks, can I ask you something? I blinked and nodded, making her smile. Can Naruto-kun stay with our clan while you're away? I don't see why not, but you know your father is going to lose it when you bring him home. She laughed as she put a hand on his chest and started to run her hand over his hair again. Father will have to get used to it. Naruto-kun is always going to be around me if I have my way. I blinked as I looked down at the little girl as she smiled down at him. Okay, maybe this girl is more aware of these things than I gave her credit for. Maybe I should start planning for a great-grandchild in a decade or less if she or that Anko girl if he started taking a liking to her. I walked into the house and up the steps for one of the pre-sealed travel scrolls I made in the case. I needed them. I wonder how she's going to take seeing me again. I know down my old friend was killed, but my thought trailed off as I thought of the man who the woman my Makino liked. Sir Shanks. I looked back and saw Anbu in a plain mask. Tell Danzo to leave this place alone, Root. I know where the bases are in and outside the village. 16 in the village and 27 outside with the main base on the hill east of the village. He stood there for a moment, then left my house. I felt 12 more leave the house and the area around us. I could feel everyone was still calm and relaxed energy. I guess I do need to activate the defense seals. I slipped all but 2 money scrolls into my storage scrolls on my side. I knew what Danzo wanted, and he wouldn't take this laying down. I turned and started to walk to the far room I knew still had active seals. Sir Shanks. I turned to see MYU and Emma both looked like they knew. It was Danzo's Root Anbu. I didn't think he'd try these, but now that I made the lines clear, he's trying his luck. So, would you two go ahead and take a week's worth of clothes for Naruto and head back to your compound? Looks like I have an extra stop to make. I tapped my scroll and a money scroll puffed out. I grabbed the scroll and held it out to them. What is this? Pay for a personal S-class mission for the Hyuga clan to protect Naruto until I return. Oh, And if you'd like, I could take those seals off as thanks for all your work. They blinked, and then they rushed me. As the two pressed hands to my chest, I put my back against the wall. You can remove the caged bird seal. I nodded before I tapped the scroll holding all the counter formulas I'd made over the last 20 months. I've heard they use these seals to cause you all pain with a hand seal. I know they altered the original seal, given my grandfather was the one to build it. They nodded as I pulled the two papers out as moved some bandages off their foreheads. I frowned as I looked at the X with two revere's hooks on their forehead. Tell Hiashi this stops now as I hold the rights to the original contract this if I decide to remove the seal of anyone who has a bastardized version on them or to make good on the contract to have the original placed on the whole like it was agreed on when my clan gave yours the seal. Tears filled their eyes as I placed both counter formula seals on their heads. I raised my two fingers and activated the formulas. They hissed in pain for a moment before the pieces of paper fell to the floor. They rushed to the bathroom. It worked. They started to cry and cheer before Emma ran out of the house, and Myu quickly rushed into Naruto's room. I smiled before I walked over and watched her put clothes into a bag. Hey. She looked up from the bag. Here is a scroll explaining everything we just talked about. He and his father may not be aware of this and if they are well. She smiled and then took the scroll, and before I knew it, she kissed my cheek and ran off with the scroll and bag. Damn. I guess being 46 doesn't put too much of a damper on my game. Maybe I should try to get with Tsunade this time around. She was 2 years younger than me. Gramps. I smiled at Naruto's yell and laughed before I walked out and sealed the rooms shut as I walked down the steps. Naruto stood at the bottom with Hinata holding onto his arm as Myu hugged Hinata, tears in her eyes. You made Myu-chan cry, old man. I laughed as Naruto tried to punch me. I slapped each punch away and smiled as he tried to fight me. I grabbed his arm as he kicked my shine. Easy Naruto, Myu can explain it when you two get a little older. But, she's not crying from pain or sadness. I let his arm go and then started for the door, all of them close behind. When they walked out of the house, I placed my hand over the seal on the wood and activated the house security seal on the house. Gramps. I nodded as I walked up to the gate and closed them before activating the seal around the compound. I nodded as I turned and looked down at Naruto. I kneeled to be level with him and put my hand on his head. Be good for the Hyuga clan, Naruto. I'll be back with Tsunade before you know it. Okay, Gramps. They started to walk away, and I smiled as I walked to the main gate. Naruto POV 2 days later. Naruto-kun. I opened my eyes and leaned my head back to look down at Hanabi from my sitting position on the underside of the roof. Hey Hanabi-chan, what can I do for you? Father and grandfather want to have a word with you. Plus, some lady is here looking for you. Sure, Hinata-chan, you want to come? I turned my head and smiled as I looked at my best friend beside me. She opened her eyes and smiled at me as she looked at me. Sure, besides we need to get something to drink, it's a little hot out today. I nodded, and we both stood up. Iced tea or water? We jumped down to the balcony next to Hanabi. The iced tea with some would be nice. I nodded, and Hanabi grabbed onto my right arm, a happy smile on her face. I laughed as Hinata grabbed onto my left arm with an annoyed pout on her face. I blushed as the two glared at one another. Can we please just go? They smiled and nodded before we started to walk. I blushed harder as the maids laughed and talked with each other. So Naruto-kun, do you think I can sit with you at dinner tonight? I laughed as Hinata pulled on my arm hard. No, Naruto-kun will be sitting with me. Hanabi pulled on my arm hard, pulling me to the side just. Hinata jerked my other arm, and my shoulders started hurting. I used Soru to get out between the two and started to run down the hall. Naruto-kun. I heard them yell before I heard them running after me. I ran for the training hall, knowing that is where Hiashi spent most of the day with his father, watching the main house as they trained. I have to get to him before they catch me. I don't want to spare against him again if he catching Hinata clinging to me again. Hanabi would only make it 10 times worse. Naruto. Sorry Lady Hinoka, I can't talk. I smiled as I rounded the corner and saw the training hall door open. I slowed down, not wanting to just burst in and be rude to everyone in the hall. Naruto-kun. I froze as the two jumped onto my back, and we crashed into the training hall. We rolled across the floor a few times, and Hanabi lost her grip on my cloak. We stopped, and Hinata sat on my stomach and rubbed her head before looking down at me. I guess you want to have another match, Naruto. I paled before I turned my head. I looked at an angry-faced Hiashi and a giggling Anko. She smiled at me, then waved her hand down, and I looked back at Hinata and saw I'd put my hands on Hinata's thighs without realizing it. She put her hands on my chest before standing up with a red face and used Soru to get out of the room. I jumped up after that and got on my hands and knees in front of Hiashi. I swear I didn't mean for that to happen. Too bad. I jumped to the side as Hiashi slammed a gentle fist onto the ground, where I was a second again. The wood under his hand was destroyed. Fight Gaki. Last long enough and I'll give you a prize. I used Soru to get some space between us, and she charged me in his gentle fist stance. I dropped into the crimson fist Gramps has been teaching me. Okay, Naruto, remember to lock his arm and aim for his Adam's apple, then follow through with his best to throw. I dodged to the side of his gentle fist strike and tried to grab his wrist. But, he was too fast for me to grab his wrist. He turned, and I barely managed to dodge another strike from him. I clenched my fist. I infused chakra into my fist and arm. I released the chakra as I aimed for his right knee. He jumped back, and I swung my fist down to the ground. I smashed the wood on the floor, breaking it into splinters. He and Anko looked shocked as I pulled my fist out of the wood. How did you do that, Gaki? Anko had a smile on her face, and Hiashi looked quite surprised. Gramps and I finally got to the advanced set of moved from the Crimson Fist style. Now that I have the 20 stances down and finally have the chakra control, I can start to use the real style. But I know I can't win this. I have no real fighting experience. Hiashi blinked and a smirk formed on his face as he looked at me. Well, consider me impressed, Naruto. To have this level of skill and control at your age is remarkable. I smiled before he spoke again as he charged me. Hinata has also improved greatly over these 2 years as well. I deflected the 2 strikes using my chakra as Gramps taught me to. I covered my forearms in a thick layer of chakra and did my best to block each strike. Thanks to the 2 years of having my clones fight Hinata every day, I memorized about 90% of the stances. Crimson Axe. I swung my leg hard, and a chakra blade came from my foot, forcing him back. The blade impacted the wall, citing the wooden support and 2 feet on either side. Gaki. Anko looked at me with wide eyes. I looked to the side, and Hiashi dropped his stance shocked. Crimson style. It must a dangerous style with those defensive skills and the 2 attacks you used. Redirecting a gentle fist is not an easy feat for an experienced fighter. I sighed as I lowered my fist as looked at him. Yeah, but that much chakra in my arms and legs sting and burn once I stop the flow of chakra. Gramps said it would take a few years before my body got used to it. He also told me this style was made for users of our bloodline. How so, Gaki? I looked back at Anko as she walked over and wrapped her arms around my neck like she does every time she sees me. She rested her chin on my head, and I could feel 2 soft orbs barely touching the back of my forehead. I blushed, and I sighed as I looked away from Hiashi. His eye twitched as he looked at us. Anko, I got him here for you now, please get on with it. Right, look, Gaki, I wanted to thank you and the old man for helping me when I ran short of cash the last 2 months. You know, I just started the 3rd year of Ninja Academy. You 2 made it so I could afford the gear and tools. After that snake ran off, nobody is willing to help me. Not to mention you help feed my dango addiction. I still say Roman is better. She tightened her arms around my neck. Tighten. Do not start that again with me, Gaki. I laughed as she pulled me back into her body. I gulped as I saw Hinata walk into the room. She looked at us, and I watched her face turn red from anger. She got into the hush so Ken wave stance. I quickly threw my hands back, grabbed her thighs, and pulled her off the ground. Soru. We reappeared outside, and I quickly put her down before the shockwave destroyed the doors. What the hell? Sorry, Anko. Give me the prize later. I used my Soru again, hoping to get enough of a head start. Naruto-kun. She appeared in front of me, still in her hush so Ken wave stance. I jumped as she sent another palm wave at me. I landed behind her and hugged her into my chest, knowing this would stop her anger for a moment. She relaxed into my arms before I used Soru again. I reappeared in front of the shocked main house and the branch members cleaning up the mess we'd made. Hinata held onto my arm, and I looked at Hiyashi pleadingly. He nodded before he walked over and picked her up, breaking Hinata out of her bliss. She started kicking, and I knew she couldn't use Soru while she didn't have a sure foothold. Go on Naruto, we'll calm her down. Why don't you and Anko go out for a while? No. Naruto-kun, let's go get Roman. Hanabi rushed over and grabbed onto my waist. I laughed and patted her head before I picked her up and put her on my back. Okay, I'll tell you what. I started to walk behind Hiyashi, Anko at my side. Once your sister relaxes, well, I'll go. Hanabi nodded, then we looked at Hinata as Hiyashi let her down. She dusted herself off and then walked over to me. She grabbed a hold of my jacket and gave me a little shake. The only girls allowed on your back is me and Hanabi unless I tell you otherwise. She gave me another hard shake before letting me go, then walked over to Anko and kicked her shine hard. She jumped up and down on one leg, cursing under her breath as she glared down at Hinata. Hinata turned the kicked Hiyashi's shine just as hard, making his jump on one leg like Anko. She looked back at me, and I gulped, scared of the jealous Hinata. Hanabi gripped my neck tight, and she was shaking a little bit as she looked at her sister. Sis is scary. I nodded and I could feel Hiyashi and Anko do the same. I walked down the dirt road heading for the bar of the town. I stopped at the door. I looked around and smiled as I sensed a powerful life force inside the bar, with a second but only a third of the power. Yeah, that's her. But, who is the other one? I opened the door to the bar and walked in. I looked around and saw a woman sitting at the bar with 2 bottles beside her. She had a fair skin with brown eyes and straight blonde hair that parted above her forehead. Her hair was shoulder-length bangs that framed her face, and the rest reached her lower back. She wore heels, sandals, black jeans, a half kimono top, and a green gambler jacket. Behind her was another fair-skinned woman. She was of average height and had a slender build with onyx eyes and jet black hair. Her hair was straight and shoulder length with bangs that covered her ears and framed her face. She wore a long bluish-black kimono with white trimmings, held closed by a white obi, and open-toed sandals with low heels. I smiled and tapped the wall 3 times before I kicked the wall. Tsunade's head shot up, and she looked over at me. The other woman turned, and I saw a pig in her arms. It had a red coat on with a large bead necklace. Tsunade stood up, knocking the 2 empty bottles over. Shanks. I smiled as I rested my arm on my sword. It's been a while, huh? She pushed past the woman and jumped onto me, hugging me tightly. I patted her back before she lowered her arms, then she pulled back. She grabbed my cape and pulled the right side away. I sighed as she looked at my missing forearm. Why your forearm? I laughed and patted her back again. Yeah, lost it in a nasty fight with the Jinchuriki of the 4 tails. The fight lasted 3 days, and I lost it to a lava attack. I pulled the sleeve up and showed her the burned scars. Oh Cammy. I laughed as I pulled the sleeve back down over my elbow. I smiled as I put my hand on the back of her head and pressed my forehead against hers. I'm sorry for not coming to find you sooner. I was trying to find any survivors of our village's fall. She wrapped her arms around my chest, moved her head from mine, and buried her head in my chest. You damn fool. Why the hell didn't you come from me after you were hurt? I laughed as I ran my hand down her back. I know I was stupid for not trying to find you for help. But, I got news if you'd like to hear. She nodded as the other woman walked over. I found more than 100 Uzumaki clan members, many of which I've sent letters to over the last few months. I've settled in Konoha and get this, my grandson Naruto is alive. She pulled her head out of my chest. A confused look turned to a pissed-off look. My godson is alive. I blinked before she pulled away from me and had her fist balled. I blinked before she walked over to the other woman. Shizune, get ready to get back to the leaf. I'm going to see who lied to me about my godson was dead. The woman nodded, and I was happy to have her name. Shizune, that is a lovely name, miss. She blushed and bowed before she walked over and grabbed 2 large bags from where Tsunade was sitting. I can seal those in a scroll if you'd like. Shizune looked at me and smiled before she nodded. I pulled out a medium-sized scroll from my main storage scroll. I unrolled the scroll, and Shizune put the bags on top of the scroll. I clapped my hand down on the scroll and sealed the bags inside. It is so good to know I have a scroll master with us. Quote. I looked up at a smiling Tsunade. Well, I'm glad to be traveling with two beauties. But, to be honest Tsunade, I expected a fight when I found you. Tsunade blushed and looked away from me. Well, I know you wouldn't drag me back kicking and screaming. But, I want answers about why I was told my godson was dead. I nodded as I closed the scroll and put it back into my main scroll. Oh, I already have them beaten into their place after 2 years. I found those damn villagers chasing a bruised and beaten Naruto. I felt my anger rising again, some of the floors cracking under my feet. My 6-year-old grandson had to dig through trash to find food and clothes. I went to that damn village to visit my daughter's grave after getting that damn letter and I find that. I made my point quick and clear. Tsunade's key exploded, and Shizune looked ready to rip someone apart. It was those damn elders and civilian council, right? I nodded as Shizune paid the tab. Yeah, not long after I found all but the Hyuga clans tried to adopt Naruto. The Inuzuka clan tried more times than anyone else. Soon the Inuzuka clan head seemed to have had her clan keep an eye out for Naruto and she could. I'll have Toy thank her for that later. But, what about the Hyuga clan? Why haven't they tried? We walked out of the bar. Not sure, but I never cared enough about their clan to find out. But, the heiress and her sister have taken a great deal of interest in Naruto. What are their names? Hinata is the heiress and Hanabi is the name of her younger sister. But, I think I made a mistake by training Hinata with Naruto. She's become rather attached to him. Tsunade raised an eyebrow as we walked. Good attached or? I sighed before I looked up at the sky. I'm afraid sheer that Anko girl jump will jump him once he's become a ninja. I know they care for him and not his clan heir stats, but I'm not even in my 50s yet. I don't want to be a great-grandfather yet. Tsunade laughed as she looked at me. 46 and already a grandfather, Shanks. Your daughter was born when you were what, 21? I nodded and sighed as we walked. Yes, Kushina died at 23, sure as a ninja she lived longer than many of her class from what I know of. But, she was still too young. Tsunade and Shizune nodded a second later. I looked down at Tsunade before an evil smile formed on her face. Well, why don't we figure out what I'm going to do to that damn council and those damn elders? Naruto of 2 days later. Sis is scary. I nodded as Hanabi hid behind her mother as I watched Hinata destroy another branch member in a training spar. Her gentle fist was even with any of the adults of the main family. I chewed on a dango stick from some dango Anko came by with earlier. At least she didn't use Soru or the Hush So Ken wave. Naruto-kun. I came out of my thoughts before looking over at Hinata. My turn. She smiled and nodded, then got to the other side of the training hall. I got up and summoned my 2 wooden swords. The whole of the main branch watched as I got into the first crimson sword stance. I crossed my arms, my swords facing down to the ground, also touching. My feet should width apart, my upper body forwards, my head low. I watched as Hinata dropped into her hybrid stance. I smiled as she dropped into a low stance with her left leg far out. Her right knee was bent with her hand in a praying mantis 2-finger stance. What is that stance, Hinata? Hinata ignored her father and then jumped at me with Soru. The wood under her feet shattered as she vanished. I saw the shocked faces as I threw my body to the side as she appeared a strict just missing my chest. I swung my sword and then caught her side. I jumped back as a puff of smoke coming from her. Shadow clones again. Yes. As quickly as I could, I used the armament hockey I'd learned so far. Why does my armament suck so much? I felt 2 fingers slam into my side before a shockwave palm strike slammed into me. I coughed as a shockwave slammed me into the wall. I kicked myself free and looked at Hinata as she waved her hand in the air. I hate that blown line of yours sometimes, Naruto-kun. I smirked before I swung my swords, sending a blast of air at her. She crossed her arms as she was sent flying out of doors to the outside training ground. I jumped out after her father, mother, and everyone else close behind. I landed on the small pond as Hinata landed and skidded across the field before she stopped and dropped back into her stance. I smiled before going into the second base stand. I turned my left wood sword, let the tip dip into the water, and pulled my right wood sword on my shoulder. I pushed my left leg back and bent my right, making my body lean forward. Hinata smiled as she looked at me. Oh, going for speed this time, Naruto-kun. Yep. I summoned my chakra and filled my lungs, turning it into the air with it, then I turned my spitting the stick at her. I used my soru and appeared in front of her as she dodged the stick. I swung my left sword up, just catching the edge of her jacket. She jumped from my lower swing, but my overhead caught her as I forced her into the wall, my sword at her throat. I smiled as Hinata glared at me. Using my observation haki, I felt Hiashi and his elite clan's men with him. No fair. You cheated with that stick. I tapped her neck and stepped back. That's what 8-6 now. Hinata puffed up her cheeks as she looked at me. You cheated. I laughed as I felt the elites go off. All fair in a fight, Hinata-chan. Ah. I laughed more as Hinata started beating my arm with her two balled fist, calling me Baka repeatedly. Third person Pav. The whole of the Hyuga clan watched as the heiress that they all thought was so weak. She was destroying the best they had. But her hybrid stance beat out his gentle fist in speed and power. But, what shocked them more was the fact that the so-called demon boy was keeping pace like it wasn't a problem. He matched her speed and power, if not beating it. Can't believe they're that strong. They looked behind them to see a few Anbu looking at the two children. In the center of them was a group of shocked clan heads with the Hokage. They looked back and saw Naruto start running away from an angry-looking Hinata. They watched as two children jumped onto the main house's roof. Naruto ran for his life. Hokage, do you think we could get Lord Shanks to teach the rest of the clan heirs? Tame asked as she watched the boy she'd tried to adopt run from Hiashi's pup. Having seen what the two could do, she knew without a doubt that they'd both become alphas in their own right. Naruto, why did I bring up training with Anko? I jumped down to the training field and ran like hell. And why is she so mad? Anko is our friend, why wouldn't I teach her a few tricks? Naruto-kun, get back here and take my punch like a Uzumaki. I kept running, not wanting to get hit in of my chakra ponets. I looked to the side and smiled, seeing the Hokage and the other clan heads. Sorry, Gigi. I took off running for the old man. I jumped onto the group and over Sum, one of the few clan heads I respected. I heard Gigi yell from the shockwave. I jumped onto the compound wall and then started running again. I tried to round a corner, but someone grabbed onto the collar of my cloak. I reached for my katanas, but the voice stopped me. Gaki, it's me. I looked back and saw Anko looking down at me. She smiled as she looked me in the eye. Slipped away from your little fangirl. I sighed before I heard rushing feet. I grabbed Anko, pulled her into my arms, and then jumped onto the roof above us. I watched as Hinata rushed by guards trying to keep pace with her. I sighed as I watched her rush by under us. Damn, that girl has it bad for you. I nodded as I jumped back down, letting Anko go. Yeah, I mean, she was my first friend, but damn, she is scary at times. Yeah, but back to why I was coming to find you. I heard you learned your elemental affinity. I nodded before I held up 3 fingers. Yeah, I have wind, water and lightning. Gramps told me he has lightning, but the other 2 we don't have many of in the village. But he has scrolls in the master scroll from our homeland. I watched a smile creep over Anko's face as we walked out of the alley. Do you think I could steal a few from you, Gaki? Never hurts to learn a few new things. I shrugged as I started heading for the main street. We can talk over the greatest food, ramen. The smile vanished before she grabbed my hair. Don't start that with me again, Naruto. Dango is the best. I grabbed her overcoat and pulled her down to be level with me. Ramen is the best, and I'm happy to fight you over it. We both raised our right fists, and we glared at one another. My Naruto-kun, don't you two look like you're having fun? We froze and slowly turned our heads and saw Hinata standing there, tapping her foot. She had her arms crossed, and the glare on her face was one I knew well. Hinata-chan, I promise. If you let my running away go, I'll take you out for a nice walk or to get some cinnamon buns. As many cinnamon buns as I want. I nodded as Anko, and I let go of one another. Hinata smiled before walking over and wrapped her arms around my right before she kicked Anko's shine hard. She yelled and cursed as Hinata pulled me down the street. Damn, Hinata has changed so much other the last 2 years. Naruto-kun, do think we'll be in the same class at the academy? I got my feet in step with Hinata before I responded. I don't know, but it would be nice to know I'll be with my best friend. She smiled with a slight blush and rested her head on my shoulder. I saw some villagers glaring at us as we walked, but having heard of Gramps' threats to the village and the economic power my clan now held, they couldn't touch me, let alone kick us out. You have that smile again. I laughed as Hinata locked our fingers together. I'm just thinking about how now they can't tell us to leave or throw us out of the stores. Remember the store owner grabbed me and threw me out. I didn't think Gramps could catch me and kick him in the back at the same time. Haha, yeah, I remember. Oh, father was so mad when he heard they called me a demon lover. I still have a hard time believing it took the two to less than an hour to have the store closed down. I nodded as we got to the bakery. I opened the door, and we walked into the shop floor. The smell of cinnamon buns filled the air, and I was happy to see them pulling out a fresh tray from the oven. We got in line, and Hinata rubbed her cheek onto my shoulder. I laughed as we waited. I heard the door open again and then close. Hey, move. I blinked, then turned my head and saw a boy standing behind us. He had black hair with a blue shine to it. His skin was pale with black eyes. He had on a high-collared long-sleeve shirt and white shorts. He had bandages wrapped around his forelegs and ninja sandals on. No, we got here before you. He narrowed his eyes at me, then looked at Hinata. He reached out to grab her, and I moved and made Hinata move to the side. She moved her head as I spoke to this guy. Naruto-kun. Hinata turned, and we both looked at this guy. He glared at Hinata before he tried to shove us. I smacked his hands away, and he looked really annoyed. Don't touch my Hinata-chan. I wrapped my arms around Hinata, and she smiled. She leaned into my chest and smiled. Look, you and your little bitch need to get out of my way. I'm an Uchiha and be glad I don't take her from you, Dobi. Whatever, duck butt. We were here first, now wait your turn or get the beat down it's clear you need. I watched his frown turn into a snarl. You damn Dobi. He pulled his fist back, and I reached for my sword. Enough. We all jumped and looked up to see the head baker looking down at us. He glared down at us, but his face softened as he looked at us. Naruto, I saw you walk in with Hinata. I got a baker's dozen of fresh cinnamon buns set aside in a bag. Come back with the money later. No reason you two take what this Uchiha is spitting at you. Thanks, chef. I'll be sure to bring a tip for you. Hinata let my hand go and get her cinnamon buns. I locked eyes with this Uchiha again, my arms crossed as we looked at each other. He glared at me with hate-filled eyes. You can glare all you want. I don't have to do a thing you tell me to. You will do as I say. The Uchiha are the strongest clan in the village. I laughed as Hinata walked beside me, a cinnamon bun in hand. He looked away from me, then looked at Hinata. He looked her up and down, then smirked as he looked at her face. He pointed at her with a smirk on his face. Now that I've seen both sides, I think I'll be taking you from this loss. In one swift motion, Hinata kicked him into the wall, knocking the air out of him. He crashed back down to the ground, coughing up his lungs. Come on, Naruto-kun. Hinata grabbed my hand, but I knew it wasn't right to walk away without paying, even if he said it was fine. Just wait outside, Hinata-chan. I can't leave without paying the man. The Tem gets up, I'll deal with him. Okay, Naruto-kun. She quickly walked out of the shop, and I pulled my red swirl wallet out of my cargo shorts. I sensed a punch coming my way and leaned to the right, making the punch miss. I leaned from side to side and jumped when he tried to sweep my legs. Once I'd paid, I turned fast and kicked the Tem hard in the face. I sent him through the door Hinata was holding open. I watched him skip across the road a few times before he crashed into the building across the street. Nice kick, kid. I smirked and gave him a wave before I slipped my wallet back into my pocket and then walked out of the still open door. I wrapped my arm around Hinata's shoulder as a crowd formed around the Tem. Let's walk around, Naruto-kun. Hinata finished her bun as we rounded the corner to the Hokage Tower. I stopped seeing Gramps walking down the street with two women. They both looked beautiful, and I smiled. Hey Gramps. They all stopped, and Gramps turned around to look at us. He smiled, but the second the blonde-hair woman saw me, she started to run at us. I panicked, and before I knew it, I picked Hinata up, making her up before I used Soru to get on top of a building. I looked down over to the side of the roof and jumped back as she jumped up and grabbed a hold of us. Naruto. She shoved Hinata away and pulled me into a tight hug. I struggled for a second before I realized she wasn't hurting me. I'm so sorry Naruto. I'm sorry I wasn't there. She rubbed her cheek on mine, and I looked at a shocked Hinata. I mouthed help me before Gramps jumped up a woman on his shoulder. Tsunade maybe try not to smother my grandson. This woman glared up at him, letting me go a little. Leave me alone. I'm trying to make up time with my godson before I go and kill those damn elders and those damn councils. Expect soon, I think I'll take my second apprentice from her clan. After she yelled at him, she crushed me again in her arms. I stood there for another second before I wrapped my arms around her lightly. I didn't know this woman, but Gramps seemed to. If he trusted her, then that was good enough for me. She started to sob as she clung to me. I promise I'll always be here like your grandfather Naruto. I smiled and patted her back before I tried to pull back. She clung to me for a second before Shanks put a hand on her shoulder. Slowly she let me go and stood up, looking down at me. I smiled up at her, and she smiled back down at me. Naruto-kun. I looked back over to Hinata as she looked down at the street. I blinked and walked over, and I saw members of the Uchiha clan tearing the street apart. Must be trying to find me. I beat that Tem pretty bad. Why did you beat an Uchiha? I looked up at Gramps and frowned. He called Hinata-chan a bitch and said he was going to take her. No one will call a lady that or treat her like property with me around. You raised him well, Shanks. But, that Uchiha brat needs to be taken down a peg. I looked back at the lady Gramps called Tsunade before she jumped down to a tall woman with black hair. The woman looked shocked and quickly bowed to her. She waved her hand before she started to talk to her. After a second, she and the woman looked back up and waved for us to come down. Come on, Naruto, you carry your girl down. I glared up at Gramps before he smirked and jumped down. Naruto-kun. I sighed before I picked Hinata up in my arms, making her turn red again, then used Soru to jump down. I landed in front of Tsunade, making her smile. I set Hinata back on her feet, then turned and grabbed the Tem's hand as he reached for her. I used my new chakra-enhanced strength. I started to crush his arm. He screamed as he grabbed onto my arm. Hey, let go of my brother. I let his arm go and sidestepped a girl before she could hit my back. She missed the punch and went to fall. I threw my arms out, catching her mid-fall. She stopped, and I noticed she was as light as Hinata was. I pulled her back onto her feet. She looked at me, and I saw she was about as tall as Hinata and Ino. She had her black hair tied back into a ponytail. She had on a black battle thigh-length kimono with red trim with a pair of black shorts coming out from the bottom. She had sandals like ninjas on. I smiled at her before I sidestepped a punch after the Tem, letting her get hit in the face. They both went to the ground, the girl yelling for him to get off. Sasuke, get off me. I sighed as I looked down at them, then I kicked Sasuke off her, and he coughed as he held his ribs. I held my hand out to the girl as she held her right cheek. She took my hand, and I helped up back onto her feet. Naruto-kun, she's going to have a bruised cheek. I nodded as Hinata spoke up. I can help with that. Tsunade walked over, hands glowing green. Lady Tsunade. The girl smiled as she looked up at her, and I saw the red cheek. She put her hand on her cheek, and I sighed before I turned, pulling one of my kunai. I blocked Sasuke's kunai, and I looked at the mad look in his eyes. You're not going to win. I summoned my wooden sword but stopped when an Uchiha man grabbed me and pulled me up and back from Sasuke. I looked up at the man. He had short, brown hair reaching his shoulders and onyx-colored eyes with visible creases. He wore a simple kimono with gray pants, and he had a pissed-off look on his face. Let my grandson go before you lose that hand. Everyone stopped at Gramps' voice, and before I knew it, Gramps had his sword at the man's throat. The man let me go, and Hinata pulled me away from him before she punched the man in the nuts. He screamed and fell back, holding his balls. Dad. Father. Sasuke ran over, holding his side, and the girl stood there shocked. I didn't want to fight Uchiha Sasuke. Leave us be and there will be no more fighting between our clans. Don't take my works to heart and I'll make what the Kyuubi did look like a toddler having a fit. I looked at Gramps as the people around us backed away. Gramps, can you really do that? He looked down at me and smiled. Naruto, I fought the four-tailed Biju and lived to tell the tale. I may be getting on in years but I'm still far from weak in my age. Not to mention the powers of our bloodline that made Madara Uchiha second guess fighting our clan. I noticed the girl Uchiha girl looking at me. I smiled at her, and she looked away from her. Naruto-kun, we need to go. You know Hanabi will be after us if we're gone for too long. Hinata grabbed my hand and gave my hand a pull. Okay, I know she'll come hunting for us in her share of the buns. She smiled, then leaned into my side, and rested her head on my shoulder. I noticed her looking at the Uchiha girl, and she seemed to be staring back at her. Then she locked eyes with me. Why do I have a bad feeling? Shanks Pav. I smiled as I sat on the porch and watched Naruto as he and Hinata started to help Hanabi with how to unlock and use chakra. I laughed as she sat on Naruto's lap and meditated like I had taught the two before her. How are they doing with her? I looked back and saw Tsunade as she walked over with a tray in hand. She set it down beside me, and I smiled, seeing 3 glasses of water and 2 sake bottles. Where is Shizune? Tsunade sat down on the wood beside me. She took one of the sake bottles and opened it before she spoke. She's off at the hospital. She went to get some medical supplies for us. I know about how you Uzumaki who have hockey train. Naruto is going to take a lot beating while training. I laughed before I took the other bottle and grabbed the cork with my teeth. I pulled the cork out, then spit it over and into the trash can. I smiled and started to drink. Nice shot. I nodded before I sighed and set the bottle down. I looked at Tsunade, and I smiled as she leaned back, moving her hair out of her face. She ran it behind her ear and took a long sip from her bottle. I saw a flash of the young Tsunade I spent time with in Uzu as a younger kid. I laughed and nodded my head. Tsunade looked away from the kids and at me, an eyebrow raised. What is funny, Shanks? I smiled as I looked at her. Just thinking of the past, Suant. Looking at you now, I can't help but remember the girl I met in the streets of Uzu 34 years ago. To think that little teen-year-old girl I met at 12 would grow into a beauty and the great medic nin of our era. Tsunade laughed with a blush on her face. She stood up, then walked over and sat back down on my other side. She sat down beside me and sat her sake bottle down. She grabbed my sake bottle out of my hand and then sat it down. She put both of them away out of my reach. Shanks, can I ask you something? I blinked, not sure what she was up to. She leaned into my arm and grabbed my hand. I blinked a few times before she rested her head on my shoulder. Okay, what the hell is going on? Shanks, do you think Makino would be mad if I wanted to see you as more than a friend? Not right away, but maybe after a year or two. I blushed before I looked away from her. I laughed, a deep blush coming across my face. Well, actually, Makino was a woman who, well, Kami, this is hard to say. Toussaint, Makino talked about getting you alone with just the two of us. I looked back at Tsunade, who looked confused, then it hit her. She turned red before she quickly grabbed the sake bottle. She turned the bottle up and started bounding the bottle. I laughed and nodded before I turned back and jumped, seeing Hinata standing there with a smile on her face. Tsunade stopped, and we both looked at her. Her smile turned to a smirk at me before taking the tray with the glasses of water. She quickly walked back over to Hanabi and Naruto. Hanabi jumped up to take the water, but Hinata made her settle down. Before Hanabi could sit back in Naruto's lap, Hinata took her set and set the tray to the side, and I swear she was moving her butt around a little. Okay, forget the ninja graduation. She may jump him before that. I nodded before I got up and grabbed my sake bottle. I looked over and saw my grandson's red face before he grabbed Hinata's thighs and threw her up out of his lap. He vanished a second later. An annoyed Hinata activated her Byakugan. She looked around for a second before she took off into the woods. I started to down my bottle too. Third pa of academy years. First year. Naruto sat with Hinata in class, and Ino sat on his other side. Over the last few weeks, Ino had seemed to take a more active role in Naruto's life after talking with her father about training. Hinata, for her part, didn't care for her right now. Ino had started cutting into her private training time with her Naruto-kun. In front of them was Sasuke Uchiha with two new fangirls on his sides. Behind them was Yui Uchiha, and she was staring at the back of Naruto's head. Something about the boy caught her attention. As she stared, the door opened, and in walked two men. The first man of average height and build. He has black hair that was kept in a ponytail, dark eyes and a scar that runs across the bridge of his nose. He wore the uniform of the ninja of Konoha. The other man had white shoulder-length hair with a slight hint of blue to it and green eyes. He wore the Konoha nin flak jacket standard attire and forehead protector like a bandana. They stood in front of the class before getting the class's attention. Okay class. The class, not counting Naruto and Yui. A tick mark appeared on Iruka's forehead before he used his original genjutsu. His head grew 5 times its regular sizes before he yelled. Shut up you shitty brats. The class shut up and gave Iruka and his partner their full attention. He smiled and started to take roll for the class as Naruto leaned back into his seat. Hinata leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder. Ino leaned in on Naruto's other side but didn't rest her head on his shoulder. Yui looked down at Hinata and Ino with an annoyed look on her face. Once roll call was taken, Iruka took the class outside to start the first class taijutsu class. Parents were waiting outside, and Naruto saw his gramps with Tsunade and Shizune beside him. Naruto saw Tsunade leaning against his gramps and smiled. Naruto wanted his gramps to make friends like he had. Naruto looked back at the class as the first 2 students stepped up. Most of the kids were civilian students but were glad to see their kids fight. But, most acted like the fight was a brawl. Until Hinata came up, and she faced off against Yui Uchiha. Naruto walked beside Iruka, knowing he might have to pull Hinata off Yui. Hiyashi and Hinoka smiled as they watched their girl get ready to fight. Near them, the Uchiha elders and the mother of Yui and Sasuke Makoto Uchiha smiled as she watched her daughter walk into the ring. Beside her was Fugaku Uchiha. Their father smirked, knowing his daughter would beat the demon brast's little whore. Make the hand sigh. Hinata and Yui did as they were told. Hajime. Hinata dropped into her mixed stance, and Yui stood in a Muay Thai stance. Iruka looked at Hinata with a raised eyebrow. She not using the gentle fist. She's using her original mixed fighting style. My gramps and I helped her make it. But, getting hit hurts like crazy. And if she using the shockwave attacks it's all but invincible. Really? Naruto nodded as Yui jumped at Hinata with her right arm back. Hinata smirked, then vanished and appeared beside Yui. Hinata landed a hard kick into her side, and she sent her flying outside of the ring. Yui slammed back into a tree across the field. She fell down to the ground, coughing and holding her side. Hinata bowed towards Yui before Tsunade ran over and grabbed Yui with Makoto close behind. Tsunade quickly picked her up and walked back over to the parents. Shanks pulled his cloak off and laid it down on the ground. Tsunade laid her down on the cloak and started to treat her. After she was healed, Iruka called Naruto and Sasuke to the ring. Fugaku was seething as he looked at his son, expecting him to beat that damn brat. Naruto smirked as Sasuke got into the interceptor fist stance. Fugaku smiled, knowing the fighting style he taught his son would help him beat the brat. But, he dropped into a stance that stopped Fugaku's arrogant thoughts. He was watched as Naruto dropped into the Crimson Maelstrom stance. Naruto smiled as he leaned forward, his hands at his sides, fist clenched like he was readying to draw swords. His feet were spread wide with his right leg pulled back. Come on Tem, I think I'll kick you in the face like I did at bakery. Try it you low-class clan freak. Make the hand sigh. Naruto moved his right hand and made the hand sigh, but Sasuke spat on the ground. Iruka frowned and would talk to him about proper etiquette later. Hajime. Sasuke jumped forward, wanting to put Naruto in his place and show them all the might of the elite Uchiha clan. Naruto looked at him bored before he closed his eyes and started to use his observation haki. Naruto sensed Sasuke's emotions, which were like a storm, but the emotion he felt the most was anger. No, rage was the better word. Naruto dodged the punch and sidestepped a kick. You're not calm, Sasuke. Thanks to my bloodline, I can sense not only your emotions but your presence and intentions. Observation Haki may not copy jutsu, but it can let me see all your move before you make them. Naruto slid his feet as Sasuke tried another kick. Naruto got behind him, the elbowed the back of Sasuke's head. Sasuke flew down, and his face crashed down into the dirt. Naruto felt Sasuke's anger raising, and he jumped, dodging another kick from the downed Sasuke. Naruto landed on his back, making Sasuke yell out in pain. Gramps also told me at the level he is, he can do what your clan's Sharingan only rumored to. See into the future even if it is a 10-second or so. I can't wait to get to that level to bad the other abilities my bloodline doesn't match up to my observation yet. I'd love to use my king's power and see how strong your willpower is. Or use armament Haki to just stand there and let you break your arms and legs against my blocks. Naruto felt the shock in all the parents and his classmates. When Naruto finished the little speech, he heel-kicked Sasuke hard in the side of the head, knocking him out. Naruto walked off the down Uchiha and opened his eyes before being tackled by an overhappy Hanabi. Hanabi took Naruto to the ground and sat on his stomach as she talked. Naruto-kun, that was incredible. You and sis put the Uchiha clan in their place today as the dead last of this year. Naruto laughed a little before Hinata and Ino grabbed Hanabi. They pulled her off Naruto, kicking and screaming for Naruto-kun to help her. Shanks was laughing hard, and Tsunade punched his side. She and Shizune laughed with him. All the parents but Fugaku, as his rage kept him silent. Shanks Pav. I laughed as I watched my grandson as his little fan club fought over his attention. I stopped a second later, put my hand on Fugaku's shoulder, and kept him where he was. I don't need my Haki to know you're beyond mad, Fugaku. But, if you take one step towards my grandson, I'll have to hurt you real bad. I felt him shake, and I felt the fear run through him. Shanks, be nice. I'm sure Fugaku isn't so foolish that he'd try something with all the clan heads around. I nodded as Tsunade returned to my side with my cloak in her arms. I took my cloak back and threw it over my shoulders. Tsunade leaned back into my side, and I smiled and rested my arm on my sword. Tsunade laughed before she laid her left arm onto my arm. I smiled, not shying away from her touch. I turned my hand and interlocked our hands. Tsunade smiled as the parents around us started to mutter, and I felt the jealousy of the men around me. Lucky bastard. I laughed at the voice of a man from behind me. I watched the Sasuke kid get healed by Shizune. Hey, Shanks-kun, since we got most of the clan heads here, why don't we all talk? Before I could respond, an Anbu appeared in front of us on a knee. All the ninjas around us looked at her. Lady Tsunade and Lord Shanks, Lord Hokage and Sir Jiraiya would like a word with you in the Hokage Tower. Tsunade suddenly tightened her grip on my hand before she smiled. I felt a chill run down my spine after I saw that smile. Oh Kami, I hope I can get away fast enough if she ever gets this mad at me. Jiraiya, Hiruzen, you two put this off for years. I hope you two are ready. Come on, Shanks-kun. I have a few beating to hand out. Everyone quickly cleared a path, and a few women told her to beat the pervert to death. I was a little confused as she pulled me off the school grounds. She let my hand go and wrapped her arm around mine. Shanks, I'm going to Shunshin us to the Hokage Tower. Wait. She stopped, and I smiled before I pulled out one of Minato Hiraishin Kunai. She looked at me, shocked as she started to explain. I'm a seal master, remember Haim? I have the Hiraishin notes, so it didn't take me long, and once I get the few flaws with the Hiraishin and the Rasengan fixed, I plan to teach Naruto in his last year of the academy. She smiled before she grabbed my collar and pulled me to face level. She let go of my collar, and wrapped her arm around my neck. She pressed her lips to mine. I wrapped my arm around her lower back and acted the seal to take us to the Mark I left in the Hokage office last time I was there. I felt a rush of air and nothing under my feet for a second, then I felt the ground return. Tsunade broke our kiss, and I looked at a shocked Hokage and another ma'am. I looked at him and realized this must be Jiraiya. He had waist length, spiky white hair tied back into a ponytail, with two shoulder-length bangs framing his face. There were red lines under his eyes that extended further down his face, going all the way to the bottom. He'd developed wrinkles around the corners of his mouth and a wart on the side of his nose. I looked at his attire and saw a short green shirt, kimono, and matching pants, under which it looked like he wore mesh armor that was visible at his wrists and ankles. He also wore handguards and a black belt. On his chest was a red haori with two yellow circles on each side. On his lower back was a large scroll. I looked back at his face. He had a horned forehead protector with the kanji for oil. His face grew mad as he looked at me. Who are you and why do you know the Hiraishin and why is Tsunade clinging to you? I blinked before spinning the Hiraishin kunai on my finger. Well, your godson's mother was my daughter and she and her husband wasn't a full-fledged seal master by Uzumaki standards. It took me about 2 months to learn this in the Rasengan. But, that aside, I think it's about time I gave you the beating your own for abandoning my grandson. As for Tsunade, she's my Tsunade Hime now. She and her student Shizune have been living and raising Naruto with me for the last year. And I'm getting my hits in too. His face paled as Tsunade cracked her knuckles as I summoned a wooden sword. He dropped to his knees and clasped his hands together. Wait, please. I can explain why I wasn't here. How bad could he have been treated? We stopped, and I could feel Suon's rage coming off in waves. Mine own rage wasn't much better, and I clenched my hand around the handle of my wooden sword before I used my armament haki on the wood. It turned red for a second before fading to a shiny, smooth black sword. How bad? I took a step, cracking and breaking the floor under my feet. Tsunade slammed her foot onto the floor, breaking it under her foot. My grandson had to dig through trash to find food and clothes. He had to sleep in alleyways and run from villagers who wanted to kill him for the actions of that fool of a father of his. I raised my haki-covered sword, and my conqueror's haki flared around the sword. Tsunade pulled his fist back, visible chakra around her fist and forearm. Marcy. Sorry, we're out of mercy. All we have is unyielding rage. Tsunade punched him in the face, and he crashed into the wall. His face looked like it was almost caved in. I swung my sword down and sent an attack at him. The haki-infused attack slammed into his chest and broke down the wall. An eruption of air blew out of the room, and he flew through the air for a few seconds before falling to the street. He rolled along the street before crashing into the side of a building. We seethed before I turned face and pointed the end of the wooden sword at the swollen face of the man. I blinked, then looked back at the street and saw a half-shattered stone toad on the side of the building. It was broken and cracked all around it. Well, damn, I've never seen someone manage a substitution jutsu as I hit them. 20 Anbu appeared in the room, but Hiruzen finally spoke up. Holt Anbu, you all knew how this could go. Please just get the privet contract ready to repair the building again. Tsunade looked at Hiruzen and then back at me before I resealed my weapon. I smirked before I rested my arm on my sword. Danzo and the elders demanded I hand over the scroll of mine in Naruto's clan and give them half the wealth I brought with me. Your sensei here tried to convince me to do it as well. Tsunade looked at Hiruzen, making him sweat. Sensei, I know you didn't try to force a clan god give up privet funds right in scrolls. Her sweet tone sent a shiver down the aged Hokage's spine. I summoned a rolling pin remembering his saying how his wife would swing one at him for being stupid. I covered it in haki, and Tsunade thanked me before taking a step toward him. She hit it into her offhand a few times before he got on his knees in front of his desk, begging for forgiveness. Please, you'd never understand. They wouldn't shut up about it all. They kept telling me that they would do something to Naruto so he wouldn't be allowed to go to the second year. I just wanted everything to be peaceful like your grandfather wanted. Tsunade stopped for a second before she nodded and tapped the rolling pin on his desk. She smiled and then nodded as she looked at him. Okay, well, let it go this time if you make a promise to us. I saw the life in his eyes return. Anything. Tsunade smiled as she looked at him, and I couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. My little Naruto gets to be on a team with his little friend. Hinata and Yui Uchiha, those two will keep other in check, and Hinata is all but violent with almost everyone else. He smiled and nodded his head. I promise. Tsunade smiled before she turned and walked back over to Jiraiya, a smile on her face. Third person POV second year. After the first year, it was clear Naruto and Hinata, along with Ino, provided they were at the top of the new class. Anko, Ino, and Hanabi started to train with Shanks and Naruto. Yui would watch them from time to time and learn from watching them. In class, the three ruled, much to Sasuke's ire. Naruto, Hinata, and Ino consistently scored higher in all areas than the two Uchiha twins. But Yui didn't seem to care about that. But she seemed more annoyed that she couldn't get close to Naruto. She wanted to know how that bloodline worked too. She wanted to train with him, she wanted to sit next to him and rest her head on his shoulder. She was a strong kunoichi, too, and she wanted Naruto to see that. But, every time they sparred, she was up against Hinata. She glared at the back of Hinata's head before the lunch bell rang. Yui. Yui looked away from the back of Hinata's head and glared at her brother. He flinched at his sister's glare and moved a little in his seat. He smirked and waved for her to come closer. She raised an eyebrow before she got up and walked over. She leaned on the desk and looked at her brother. What? Her tone sounded annoyed as she stared at Sasuke. He smiled before he looked at Naruto. I got a group of Uchiha and we're going to give him the beating he's due for humiliating our clan. Once he's dead we're going after his bitches and kill them all. Yui's mind filled with the images of a dead Naruto, and a sense of anger and sadness washed over in waves. Before she knew what was going on, she felt something change in her before she pulled her arm back with an open hand. The sound of the slap stopped everyone in the room. Everyone looked back and saw Sasuke holding his cheek. Sasuke looked back at his sister, shocked since she'd never slapped him before. Before he could react, Yui grabbed Sasuke's shirt, pulled him out of his seat, and got in his face. But, to his shock and horror, Sasuke meets a pair of one-tomo Sharingan eyes. If you or anyone touches Naruto-kun or tries to hurt him, Sasuke, the whole clan, won't stop me from getting to you. Sasuke nodded sacred as he looked at his sister. Yui shoved him back, and he slammed into the desk behind him. Once she calmed down, she realized she had yelled all that out. Her Sharingan faded before she felt some ki in the room. Yui slowly turned around and saw two cold stares from Hinata and Ino. Iruka and Mizuki walked in with some of the fourth-year students. After using his big head jutsu to shut up the kids, Anko smiled as she looked at Naruto, and Naruto blushed as he looked at her open overcoat. Okay, everyone, today we're going to have you all paired up with a fourth year for a weekend training trip. You'll be staying in the woods around the village. This is something new we wanted to try this year. Now, we're going to let the upperclassmen pick who they want. Now we're going to start with Anko Mitarashi. I call the Gaki. Anko yelled out before using an 8-foot white snake to mark her favorite Gaki. The snake balled up on top of Naruto's lap. Ino jumped away, scared of the snake. Hinata backed away a little, not liking the snake either. Naruto laughed before pulling his cloak and shirt to the side. Everyone saw he had muscles under the layer, and Hinata, Ino, Yui, and Anko blushed as they saw the start of a set of abs and pectorals. The snake flicked its tongue a few times before it unrolled itself, then slid up Naruto's chest and into his clothes. He closed his cloak, and you could see the snake moving around before its head popped out of his collar. It rested its head on the side of Naruto's neck and collar. Naruto laughed and patted the snake's head. It licked his hand a few times before class started back up. Anko looked shocked as she looked at her only white snake. Damn, Naga doesn't even does that with me. She just clings to stuff for heat, but she's cuddling up to him. Naruto leaned back, and the now named Naga moved her head and rested her chin on Naruto's shoulder, and looked at Hinata with a set of blue eyes. She flicked her tongue a few times before closing her eyes. The rest of the class took a student, but one was left over. Yui wasn't picked by an upperclassman. Once word got out, the Uchiha clan had lost after a decade of dominance. Many students and citizens of Konoha were outraged that the demon brat and his whore made it so the younger generation won't go near the two Uchiha in the academy, thinking them weak. I'm sorry Yui, but since you weren't picked, I'll have to place you. Yes, sir. Iruka looked down at the papers on his desk. Okay, Let's see you're a forward fighter from your test scores and formal matches. Anko. You and Naruto are both forward fighters, would you mind taking her too? I'll see to it the Hokage will add some extra pay to the D rank pay you all were getting. Anko looked annoyed, wanting to spend some alone time with the boy who caught her eye. Naruto looked at Anko and knew what was about to come out of her mouth. Anko-chan, if you do this I'll pay for your dango for the next week. A smile formed on Anko's face before jumping at Naruto. She pulled him over the desk and hugged him, making Naga hiss at the pressure on her body. Gaki, have I ever told you I love you? Naruto tried to push her face away from his. Yeah, every time I buy you dango. With all eyes on Naruto, the girls all looked ready to rip Anko off him. Anko crushed Naruto's face into her young C-cup. She smiled as she looked at Hinata and then Ino. Looks like I get to have my time with Gaki. Anko let him go before grabbing the back of his cloak. Yui, meet us at the Uzumaki compound in 2 hours. Gaki, it's dango time. Anko, wait. Shut up, spiky head. Anko dragged a yelling Naruto and a hissing Naga out the door. Naruto-kun. Hinata ran out after them with Ino and Yui close behind. Iruka sighed and quickly wrote that Anko dragged Naruto away with Naruto's 3 fangirls running after them. Iruka looked back to see a raging Sasuke Uchiha and a pissed-off looking Kiba Inuzuka. Okay, maybe I should look into that too. Kiba was enraged that his females chased after another male. Sasuke was angry as he watched his sister run out after the dobi that humiliated him. Naruto POV 20 minutes later. I sighed as I chewed on a dango stick as I planned my escape from the 4 girls around me. Anko had sat in front of the flaps, and Hinata sat down on my right with her head on my shoulder, chewing on a dango stick herself. I looked to my right and saw Yui sitting beside me, with Ino glaring at her. Can't soar out of this one. I've never done it in a crowded building. With Hinata right beside me, she's got plenty of time to grab me. I heard a hiss and looked down to see Naga as she moved around, then poked her head out of the front of my cloak. Hinata and Yui both moved away as she snatched a dango stick and tried to eat it, stick and all. I grabbed the stick for her, and she pulled the 3 dango off before slipping back into my cloak. I felt her run her head on the side of my chest. Anko, please get that snake off my Naruto-kun. Hinata yelled, and Anko sighed before taking a sip of her tea. Fine, Gaki, you need to open your cloak a little. I grabbed my cloak and opened it before I looked down at my chest. I saw her blue eyes looking up at me for a second before Anko touched her. She turned fast and bit her arm. Ah, Naga hissed at Anko again before turning her head and resting it on my chest again. Oh, great, my only Iwakuni has become attached to the Gaki. Naga, I better have a dry bite. She seemed to ignore me as she slid up my chest before she moved out of my collar and wrapped her body around my neck. She looked at Hinata again. She flicked her tongue a few more times before moving down my chest and moving towards Hinata. She hit the wall. As Naga slid up her stomach, the other half of her body fell out of my cloak. Naga slid up to her chest, and I noticed she slid between Hinata's already noticeable. We were only pre-teens, but it was clear she was going to be a beauty like Gramps when we graduated at 16. Naga got up to Hinata's face and flicked her tongue on her cheek a few times before Anko grabbed her at the neck. Got her. Naga hissed as she wrapped her body around Anko's arm. Naruto, Yui, you two go get ready. Like I said, meet me at the Uzumaki compound. Seeing my chance, I jumped over the table and ran for the door. Naruto-kun, wait. I stopped at the door and looked at Yui, who was close behind. Ino was tied to her seat by wires and with Hinata. I paled as I saw Hinata's face start to turn red with anger. I grabbed Yui's arm and quickly took off at a run. Naruto-kun. Hinata is mad, we need to run. If she gets her hands on us, we'll feel it for a week. I saw the fear in her eyes, and we started to run fast. Third person POV. Shanks watched Naruto as we ran around the house, Emma sitting with Yui as she drank green tea. He laughed as he leaned back into the couch, Tsunade resting on his side with his good arm wrapped around her. Shizune walked back into the living room with her own cup of green tea. She sat down on Shanks' offside as Naruto finally stopped and looked at the door. Shanks started to laugh as he felt the ball of rage come to the house fast. Gee Gramps. Shanks laughed a little more before he nodded his head. You know I'm not going to try and stop her. Naruto, she's your little friend, so run or take the beating you have coming. Tsunade laughed as Naruto looked at Shanks with sweat running down his face. Naruto-kun. The rage-filled yell of Hinata could be heard from the Hokage tower. Hiruzen shivered before a male scream followed it a few seconds later. I hope that wasn't from the Uzumaki compound. Or the Hyuga compound. I don't need Hiashi to try and kill Naruto. Then again, I don't need Fugaku or Inoichi trying to kill him after the letter I got from Iruka. The village hidden in the leaves was treated to the sight, and Naruto Uzumaki, the heir to the Uzumaki clan, ran with Yui Uchiha in his arms. Behind him, trying to keep up with him, was an equally scared Anko with a furious Hinata Hyuga close behind, her hands covered in chakra. Gaki, call off, you damn girlfriend. Ignoring her, Naruto ran into the Hyuga compound, hoping to run into Hiashi or Hinoka. Naruto knew if he found one of them, he'd be saved. Naruto smiled as he ran down the road and saw Hinoka with Hanabi sitting beside her at an outside table at a tea shop. Lady Hinoka. Naruto yelled his lungs out, making all the Hyuga look at him. Hinoka stood up back and turned, already guessing Hinata was chasing after her love interest again. Hinoka blinked as she looked at Uchiha Yui in his arms. She saw the bags on Anko and Yui's backs. Sorry, Lady Hinoka. Naruto and Anko ran behind her and down the street. Hinoka grabbed Hinata's shoulder as she tried to run by her. Hinata, stop chasing the poor boy like this before you chase him off for good. Hinata stopped dead after hearing her mother's words. She slumped as she watched her love turn the corner with another girl in his arms. Want to talk about it, honey? I want to be the only girl he carries like that. Hinoka sighed before she ran a hand down her daughter's back before Hanabi spoke up. Hey sis, likes strong girls like his Gramps, right? Why not invite him to the clan tournament the village is hosting when your class graduates? A smile formed on Hinata's face after hearing that. That right. The clans wanted to see the new genin class skill every year. I can show Yui and Ino where they stand in pecking order. Hinoka and Hanabi blinked, and before Hinoka could stop her, Hinata rushed off to find her upperclassmen. Mother, what did I just start? A slightly scared Hanabi asked as her mother felt a pit of fear creep up her spine. I don't know, and that scares me. I'll see if Lord Shanks and your father can stop this. Naruto Pav 3 hours later. I smiled as I sat on the side of the tree as Anko and Yui tried their hand at tree walking. Anko was going better than Yui since she couldn't get more than a few steps up. You could tell she hadn't been trained much. I sighed before I stood up and walked down the tree as Yui glared at her tree. Yui. She looked over at me, and I smiled as I looked at her. Yes, Naruto-kun. I smiled before I walked up beside her. I've been watching you, Yui. You're putting too much chakra on the bottom of your feet. Here, try walking up with me. I grabbed her hand, and she blushed before I put my foot on the tree trunk. I think of the calm and flat surface of the water. It helps to settle my mind and makes it easy to focus on a task. She smiled and nodded before she put a foot on the trunk next to mine. Okay, let's try this again. She put her other foot on the trunk, and I saw she was a bit shaky, but she smiled. I stepped on the trunk, and we slowly started to walk up. When we reached the middle of the tree, I let her hand go, and she smiled at me before starting to go higher. I nodded before I felt a chill run down my spine. I leaned my head back and saw Anko glaring at her tree as she started to get up. I laughed before I jumped off the tree and landed on the ground. I walked over to her as she kicked the tree, breaking the bark. Damn it! I smiled as I stopped behind her. Anko. She turned and glared at me. I smirked as I looked at her and unsealed a box from the dango stand. She smiled and started to reach for the box. I laughed, and she looked at me. I jumped above her and quickly walked up the tree. Hey! I sat down on the low branch but was still 12 feet off the ground. I stabbed 2 kunai and set the box on them. The hell, Gaki. I smiled as I leaned back into the tree. Anko, I've seen you train. You rely on your brute force too much while you train with Tucson's clones. Plus, you never take part in the chakra control or any training to build up your chakra reserves. Tree walking is a basic way to do that. Now, This dango and my promise to do one thing you want me to do, but. She raised an eyebrow as she looked at me. But. I smiled as I looked at her. The scroll kept the dango warm. And if you don't get up here, it will get cold. She smirked before she started up. I smiled down at her as she slowly walked up the trunk. She got a few steps from it before her foot slipped. I panicked before I threw myself off the branch and grabbed her arm. I pulled her into my arms, and I reinforced my back. I slammed back to the ground with Anko held in my arms. I coughed and groaned before Anko sat up on my crotch. Naruto, are you okay? I laughed as I leaned up on my elbows and looked at her. Damn Anko, I take a fail for you and now you call me by my name. She frowned before she grabbed my collar and glared into my eyes. Damn, Naruto, get off him. I heard Yui roar, and I ducked down as she tackled Anko off me. I cleaned up and watched them roll around until Anko pinned her. Anko was taller and more robust, so it wasn't hard for her to hold Yui down. Hey, Anko and Yui both glared at me. Stay out of this. She needs to know she's touching someone else, man. Shut up, Yui. Naruto isn't yours. As far as he's concerned, he don't have a damn girl right now. He's free game. I blinked as I looked at the two as they fighting about me having a girlfriend. I frowned before I hardened my resolve. I stood up, walked over to them, and grabbed Anko's shoulder and the back of her overcoat. I pulled her up and off of Yui, surprising them both. Everyone knew I would never touch a woman or girl. So me ripping Anko off of Yui shocked them both. I dragged the stunned Anko over to the tree and sat her down. I pulled a blunt kunai out and threw it at my two other kunai. It knocked one of them out, and the dango box fell down. I caught it before I walked away from the two and sat down with my back to the two of them. Naruto-kun. Hey Gaki, you okay? I opened the box and picked up a dango stick. I smirked, finally getting some heat off my back and seeing my chance to make a stand. You two act like I don't have a say in who I want as a girlfriend. I don't appreciate being talked about like I'm an object. I took a bite from the now cold dango stick. I left them in silence for a moment before I spoke again. I do care for you two and Ino almost as much as I Hinata and Hanabi. You two are some of the few people who have looked at me with no anger or hate. I'm grateful for that, but I want to be left alone for the rest of the day. The way you two just acted was like you were kids who were told no about something. I'm sick of the four of you acting like I'm an object and chasing after me or clinging to me in Hinata's case. I frowned before I finished the stick and bit the stick between my teeth. Anko looked hurt, and Yui looked away. I stood up, then walked over and set the dango box on the ground between them. Gee Gaki. I looked at Anko, and she flinched when I stared at her with a cold look. I wanted them to know I wanted the fighting and chasing to stop, and I needed a good time to do this with Hinata, too, but starting this meant progress. I'm starting this talk with you two. It stops here and now. You two are going to share the other two dango sticks and make peace here. I looked over at Yui, and she flinched again as she tried to look me in the eye. Yui, I want you either join in our training at home or stop hiding in the damn trees watching like a stalker. She blushed and looked down at her feet before she nodded. She sniffed a few times before she spoke. Okay, Naruto-kun, I'll be a good girl. I felt myself blush and sighed before I turned my back on them, my face still warm. I'm going to go and get some fresh meat, you two make peace. I jumped off, leaving the two behind me. I sighed as I leaned against a tree, looking down at Naruto as he sat away at his own small fire. Damn, I felt a small spike of his haki and come all the way out here for nothing. I rested my arm back on my sword and nodded before I turned, feeling the Anbu around me. I didn't feel any hate toward Naruto or Anko. Well, I guess it's okay to leave them be for now. I turned and stopped when I felt a dozen life energies vanish. I looked back to the village and nodded before I used the Hiruzen again. I appeared in the center of the village and felt around again. 4 more vanished. The Uchiha compound. I jumped, heading for the Uchiha compound. Lord Shanks. I looked back as I jumped across a rooftop. I stopped just outside the Uchiha compound as more plain masked Anbu surrounded me with swords drawn. I don't have time for all of you. I blasted them all with my Conqueror's haki. They all dropped, and I felt another 4 groups pass out. Before I moved on, I pulled out a live body sealing scroll and grabbed the closest Anbu to me. I saw a seal on the back of his neck and frowned. I slammed an ante on the back of his neck. It would deactivate all the seals on his body. I sealed his body inside the scroll before I jumped over the wall of the Uchiha compound and stopped seeing the bodies. I looked around and reached out with my observation haki. I felt maybe 50 of the 200 Uchiha were gone. I felt around and smiled as I sensed 2 powerful chakra signatures coming toward me. Let's get some backup. I pulled out a red enemy flare. I pulled the string in my teeth and sent a red flare into the air. Lord Shanks. I turned and saw Sasuke's and Yui's mother with a few other Uchiha Kunoichi with blood on her clothes and a large group of kids. She had a sword in her hand. I did a quick count, and she had 30 kids and 6 other Kunoichis. 2 in the back were wounded, and I frowned. Before I could respond, Hiruzen appeared with 30 Anbu around him. What is going here, Shanks? Someone is killing the Uchiha. I sense 2 powerful chakra signatures come my way before they call out to me. They vanished after that. My guess the reinforcement flare made it seem like more trouble than they were ready for. Hiruzen nodded before he looked at the Anbu. Spread out and get a count of the survivors. They vanished, and I sighed before I looked back and saw that she was looking around. Are you okay? She nodded as she looked at me. My sons weren't home. I don't know where they are. I frowned before nodding. I created a shadow clone, and he nodded before he jumped off. My clone will look for Sasuke, and I think your other son was Itachi, right? Yes, thank you, Lord Shanks. I nodded before I waved for them to follow me. Come on, Tsunade and Shizune are at home and I have a powerful barrier around my clan compound. Lady Makoto, I think it is best if you go with him. Lord Shanks' seals never fail and he's as strong as Cage. I nodded to Hiruzen before we started to move. Makoto walked up beside me, and I saw she had a dark look in her eyes. I can't just leave her be like thing. I cleared my throat, getting her attention. When they deal with everything, I'll take some time to help set up a barrier around the Uchiha compound, or I can talk with the council about letting your clan move to a safer part of the village. She smiled up at me. Thank you for your help, Lord Shanks. I nodded as we walked down the street. I stopped when I sensed one of the signatures appeared behind us. I turned, drawing my sword as a kunoichi blocked a sword stick with a masked man. I caught my sword in haki and jumped at him. Move. The barrier is down. Tell Tsunade to activate the barrier. They did as I told them as the masked man jumped back. I heard them start to run, and I blocked the man's path. He laughed before he jumped at me with his sword raised to stab at me. I threw my sword up as he thrusted his sword forward. I smiled when my sword broke his in two. I caught my foot, then kicked him hard in the ribs. I felt his lower ribs give way before he flew back from the impact. He skipped over the ground a few times before he slammed into the side of a building. Madara. I looked up and saw another Uchiha holding a badly bleeding arm. I felt my shadow clones dispel, and I tightened my grip on my sword as I looked at him. You little bastard. You turned on your own clan. You murdered your own father. He frowned as he looked at me. Lord Shanks, you know nothing of what happened tonight. I'm only glad my younger sister and brother didn't have to see this. I frowned before a swirl sucked him, and I blinked before I looked back at the man I'd just kicked. He swirled away, and I frowned before I remembered the kids. I Hiruzen into the compound, and I saw Tsunade and Shizune treating a few of the kids. I saw a dog-masked Anbu with a woman-cat masked Anbu standing inside the compound. I ran over to them. They looked at me as I sheathed my sword. You too. I encounter one of the attacks. One was Itachi Uchiha, and the other was a man in a black cloak with an orange swirl mask. I need one of you to talk that message to Lord Hokage. The dog nodded his head. I'll be back, face cat. He shunshin away, and I looked over to Tsunade. She looked at Shanks as she stood up from the kid sitting on the edge of the porch. Heim. She looked at me and quickly ran over to me. She held onto the back of my cape. I wrapped my arm around her. These are kids. What kind of monster attacks kids? I frowned, then laughed a little. Well, I encountered one of those monsters. I managed to break his lower ribs before he got away from me. She laughed a little before she turned her head and looked at the kids again. Luckily I didn't get my hands on him. I nodded and patted her back before dog reappeared. Makoto walked up beside us and put a hand on my arm. I felt Tsunade tighten her arms around me. Lord Third thanked you for the information, Lord Shanks. But, the Shinobi Council has called for a meeting. Lady Tsunade, I was told you were to remain here to act as a deterrent ot another attack. Squad of elite Anbu have taken up positions around the compound to protect the survives taking Shither here. Lady Makoto, as your husband is dead, you must take back the seat of head of the clan. Makoto nodded before Tsunade gave me a quick kiss on my lips before I patted Makoto's shoulder. She looked up at me, and I smiled. Don't worry, I will be more than happy to add the seals first thing tomorrow morning. A small smile graced her face as she looked up at me. Thank you, Lord Shanks. Dog grabbed our shoulders and shunted us into the council room. Makoto quickly walked over to the Shinobi Council seats. I walked over and leaned on the wall before I pulled the body scroll out. Lord Shanks, what do you have there? I smiled as I looked at Danzo after he spoke to me. He looked a little worried as he looked at me. You'll see, you old plain masked war hawk, once the Hokage arrives. He's a visible eye open, and before it narrowed, my seal to blocking control activated on my right bicep. I looked right at Danzo and spoke in a dark tone in my voice. Whoever is trying to control my mind, I have a level 10 mental attacking blocking seal on mine and everyone in my house. A deep frown crossed Danzo's face before my seal was deactivated. I smiled as I tapped the scroll on my thigh while I looked at Danzo with a smile on my face. He only glared back at me. A few moments passed before Hiruzen walked in, still in his battle gear, with a look that could kill. He walked over to his desk and sat down in his chair, giving off a massive amount of ki as he glared at Danzo. I laughed as he looked at Danzo as he sweated. Lord Shanks. I looked away from Danzo and laughed as I looked fully at his rage-filled eyes of Hiruzen as he looked at Danzo. He glared at him for a moment longer before I threw the scroll over to him. Hiruzen caught the scroll and looked at me. A live body sealing scroll. I caught a plain masked Anbu and put a powerful deactivation seal on the man after seeing a seal on the back of his neck. It forcibly shuts down all the seals on a body. The group he was with tried to stop me from getting into the Uchiha compound when I felt the life forces start to disappear. See, Ibiki will have a lot of fun with this one. I looked back to see all the elders sweating as they looked between Hiruzen and me. I suggest you, or Tsunade be there. I have a feeling someone will try something. So, does anyone know the casualties or the Uchiha clan? Hiruzen sighed as he leaned back into his chair. Yes, all the Uchiha with fully matured Sharingan were killed. All the elemental masters were killed as well. As well had the former head of the clan Fugaku Uchiha and his eye were taken. I blinked and was a little shaken at that. His eyes were taken. I snapped, sacring everyone and slammed my fist into the wall, and sent spider web cracks on the wall. I ignored their look and Sum as she tried to talk to me. You crimson-eyed bastard, you turn on your own and steal your father's eyes. Sum fell silent, and I looked back at Hiruzen. The aged man flinched a little as I looked at him. When he breaking, I want names. Everyone involved will feel the wrath of the Uzumaki elder that killed the former second Raikage and nearly the third Raikage. I slaughtered more than 600 ninjas that day, Hiruzen. Whoever planned this, they attacked the children too. With everything they'd done tonight, it will look like child's play when I get my hand on them. I saw everyone but Hiruzen shake in fear as I just let my anger and rage fill the air. The civilian had passed, and the clan head looked wholly terrified, but when I looked at Sum and Makoto, I saw faint blushes on their faces as they shook. Naruto's POV 2 days later. I walked in front of Anko and Yui. I looked at them out of the corner of my eye. They looked worried as they looked at me. I sighed before I stopped. I walked back onto the main road to the village. I'd spent the last 2 days not really speaking to the two of them outside of training. I leaned on a tree with my arms and looked at the two. They stopped as they looked at me. I know I've been cold, but it was needed. I'm sick of being jumped on or dragged around by my collar. Plus, the fact being spied on isn't fun either. I looked at Anko, and she laughed as she rubbed the back of her head. Yui blushed as she looked the other way. Yeah, we're bad about those two things. I nodded as I looked at Anko. But, none of you are as bad as Hinata when she gets clingy. Running from her isn't easy either. They laughed a little, and I frowned and sighed, resting my arm on the now destroyed swords. I was glad to finally be tall enough to wear them on my side. I glared at Yui and tapped my melted swords. She laughed as she looked at me. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to fireball them. I huffed before I stood up. If I had enough talent with armament hockey, I could have coated my swords, they'd have been fine. I need new swords since I only just started to learn ninjutsu, so all I have is my taijutsu and what little armament hockey I can use. I heard Anko laugh a little as we started to walk again. Please, your Crimson Maelstrom fist has quickly become a very powerful and coveted style. A lot of my class has tried to get your Gramps to teach them. Some shinobi and civilian clans are also trying to get him to teach their heirs. I laughed as we walked. Yeah, Gramps doesn't seem to want to have to deal with many people around the village. I think the only ones he really deals with besides us, Tsunade and Shizune Gramps, only talk to Gigi and Sum. We walked up the road, and I sighed as I walked. I stopped as we neared the gate. Naruto-kun. I slowly started to move for the tree line. Naruto-kun. I jumped up, stuck to the tree, and looked down at an annoyed Hinata and a beaten and bruised fourth-year girl. I sighed before glaring at Hinata before she could jump up to me. She stopped and blinked as she looked at me. In Naruto-kun. I took a deep breath, then jumped down and landed a few feet away from her. Hinata, I already got onto Yui and Anko for what they've been doing. I'm sick of being treated like a kami-damn object. Hinata flinched since I'd never yelled at her before. Then a blush crossed her face as she looked up at me. I huffed before I jumped away from them all. Naruto-kun, wait, please. I ignored Hinata's yell as I tree jumped like Gramps had shown me. I reached the wall after a few minutes but stopped, then sensed someone come up fast. I turned in the air and slammed into the tree trunk with a kunai in hand. I looked back and saw a plain masked Anbu. I could sense him, but he had no emotions to him. Naruto Uzumaki, please come with me. I narrowed my eyes as I looked at the man. I flared my haki and covered both hands in armament haki. The knuckles and tops of my fingers on both hands flashed red and faded to black as I looked at him. No thanks. I pulled another kunai when he reached for his sword. I jumped at him as he pulled his sword. I landed below him and blocked a sword strike. I used Soru and got behind him. I punched him in the back hard. I felt his under armor give way as he was thrown to the ground. He slammed down, and I jumped down, aiming for his back. I slammed a knee into his back, and he cried out before I spun a kunai and buried the back end of my kunai into the back of his neck. He passed out, and I sighed. Naruto. I looked to the side and saw Gramps and Suan coming fast. I stood up and looked at them as they rushed up. Gramps looked shocked as he looked down at me. Naruto, your eyes. I blinked as I looked at Gramps, then looked into my kunai. I saw my eyes were still blue but had a slit instead of a circle. What is going on with my eyes? I looked back at Gramps as I felt Hinata and the others catching up fast. Gramps looked worried as he looked at me. Naruto, you leave with Tsunade. I feel the others coming, so get going. I nodded before I holstered my other kunai before we took off. As I followed behind Tsunade, I felt Hinata still closing in on us. I sighed, knowing she would keep chasing me if I didn't turn and face her. Tsunade seems Hinata got past Gramps, and she's catching up fast. Tsunade turned her head and nodded as we jumped to the ground. A minute or so later, I watch her burst through the trees. He looked at me with a panicked look on her face. Naruto-kun. She quickly rushed over and pulled me into a tight hug. I pushed off and back, and she looked me in the eye and gasped as she looked at my eyes. Naruto-kun, your eyes. If Gramps was worried about this, I have to come up with something. I should have known this would make her panic. In my panic, I came up with a lie. Don't worry, it seems to be part of my hockey abilities. Something to do with my observation, hockey. Hinata calmed down at that, and I felt Tsunade relax as she nodded. Okay, Naruto-kun. But, why did you yell at me? I mean, sure, I know we were a little rough, but. I glared at her again, and she gulped as she looked at me. A little. You all dragged me around half the time. I yelled at her again, and she took a step away from me before Tsunade grabbed my ear. Naruto. I know we've raised you better than this. I looked back at Tsunade, a frown on his face. I pulled my ear free as I looked at her. I'm treated like a damn dog or something. Tsunade flinched at my yell. I glared at her for a minute before I jumped off again. Tsunade Pav. I sighed as I watched Naruto jump away. I frowned, but I had seen how the girls were treating him. They did treat him like a toy to fight over. Why, Naruto-kun? I looked back at Hinata, and she looked crushed as she looked at the way Naruto had left. I sighed as I looked at the poor girl. I sighed as I walked over, got on my knee, and wrapped my arms around her. She grabbed onto my gambler's coat. Why can't Naruto-kun see that we just do all that stuff is because we just want to be close to him? I sighed as I ran my hand down her back as she tried not to cry. Honey, I know, but you all have been smothering him like his voice didn't matter. You can't be angry when he finally snapped back at all of us. But, he's my first friend, I don't want him to pull away from me. I felt for the poor girl as she tried not to sob into my shoulder. Naruto, I hope you calm down soon. You'll break all their hearts if things stay like this. Academy 3rd year Pav. Naruto sat leaning back in his chair, Hinata and Ino beside him. But after the verbal thrashing he lashed out at them with last year, they all backed off. Hinata looked at him out of the corner of her eye and frowned as she looked at his shoulder. Before, she would lay her head on it for the whole day if he'd let her. But now, 2 legendary swords rested on his shoulder with a small black tiger cub in his lap. She thought back to the day Shanks gave Naruto those swords in his family's contract. 6 months ago, Naruto's house. Naruto was sparring against Hinata and Yui. Since his snap at them, his training with them had become much rougher. Before, they'd walk away with just a glancing blow from his wooden swords. Now, they would walk away with a dozen or so bruises that had to be treated by Tsunade. Naruto was still kind to them but wouldn't tell them what was on his mind anymore. He'd grown to a little cold to everyone. His grandfather had tried to break him out of it, but the backlash had also made him back off. Naruto had made it clear he wanted to be left alone. But, Shanks was a kami damn Uzumaki, leaving family out or alone was not a damn option. As Naruto spared, Shanks walked onto the field with Tsunade at his side, a large summoning scroll in Shanks' good arm. Naruto, you 3 stop for a little while, I got something for you. They all stopped Yui, thankful as she looked at the wooden sword about to strike her stomach again. Hinata sighed as she backed away from her crush and looked longingly at his back. He'd discarded his orange cloak in favor of a simple white button-up shirt that he left open until the 5th button showed off his chest and the very top of his forming abs. He turned, and you could see his longer spiky blonde hair on his shoulder and slightly going down his back. Naruto sent his wooden swords back into his wrist seals. They walked through the groups of clones training and off the water, and Shanks smiled as he looked at Naruto, hoping this would bring his smile back. Naruto, I've decided to replace your swords and to give you mine and your mother's summoning contract. Hinata and Yui look at Naruto, hoping to see his smile again. They felt their hearts lightly a little as a small smile formed on his face. Shanks and Tsunade smiled seeing that smile. Shanks kneeled down, set them down on the ground, and then unrolled the scroll. All of them looked down and saw only 4 names on the scroll. The first name was Ryuma Uzumaki, and the second was Roger Uzumaki. After Roger was Shanks Uzumaki, and he was red and not black. Naruto looked at the last black one, and he tried his best to hold his tears. Kushina Uzumaki in black. Naruto rubbed his eyes before he looked at his grandfather. How do I sign this? Cut your thumb and sign your name, then cover each of your fingers in blood, then press it to the paper under your name. Naruto nodded before pulling out a kunai, cutting his thumb, and getting on his knees. I wrote my name down quickly and did as his gramps told him. He ran his thumb over his fingers and then pressed his hand to the paper. Naruto stood back up and then looked at his grandfather. He smiled before he bit his thumb, then a seal formed on the top of his hand. They all watched as Shanks kneeled down. Shanks threw his hand down to the ground, and as it hit the ground, Shanks yelled out. Kuchio's no summoning jutsu. Enormous white cloud of smoke. A few seconds passed before a roar rang out, followed by a shockwave slammed into the young teens. Naruto grabbed onto Hinata and Yui. Naruto managed to stick to the ground with his chakra. Hinata and Yui cling to Naruto, glad he could react fast enough. Once the last of the blast passed them, Hinata and Yui got back onto their feet. They all looked up at a 20 stories tall black tiger. Yui almost fainted, and Hinata hid behind Naruto as the tiger looked down at them. The orange eye locked on them. The tiger raised an eyebrow as it saw Naruto's lock with the mighty summons. Shanks, you have someone with the same look in his eyes Roger and Ryuma did as a young Uzumaki shinobi and a Uzumaki samurai. So, he is the one you're choosing to leave Ryuma's and Odin's legacies in. I can't say I'm not happy. I can sense the willpower coming off him in waves. The feminine took the three-teen by surprise as they looked up at her. Shanks laughed as Tsunade looked down at the legendary boss summon not seen for 50 years. The tigers seemed to be about to speak again, for all the leaf ninjas appeared ready for battle. In the front stood all the clan heads with the new Jonin Zasuma, Kurenai, Might Guy, and the two Anbu captains dog and cat. Behind them stood the Anbu crops with the Hokage and Jiraiya at the very head of the forces. So the leaf Shanks. To think you'd come here of all places. Oh, well, where you chose to raise a cub is your own choice, I guess. Shanks laughed again before he sat down on the tigress's head. Yeah, but Lady Amaya. I need the swords I gave you for safekeeping. Lady Amaya laughed a little before she raised her front paw, making all the ninjas readied themselves. But, they stopped as she sat down before slamming her paw down. 3 more puffs of smoke came from the front of her paws. As the smoke, 2 normal-sized golden-armored white tigers stood there with a sword on their backs. In front of her paw was a small pup-sized black tiger cub. Vespera, my sweet little cub, you need to wake up. The cub grunted in a young feminine whine before she stood up and stretched around. She shook her body before she sat down and looked at Lady Amaya. Kawaii. Vespera jumped at the sudden yell before Yui tackled the small cub, with Hinata jumping into the smile pile. Yui pulled Vespera into her chest, and Hinata ran her fingers through her back fur. Vespera started to kick her legs as she struggled in Yui's arms. Help, mother, they're messing up my fur. Lady Amaya started to raise her paw to sweep at the two before Naruto walked over. Yui and Hinata looked at him before he held a hand out. Yui and Hinata gave him the dreaded puppy dog eyes. Naruto held his ground and glared at the two for a second before they gave in, and Yui held Vespera out to him. Naruto took Vespera and put his arms under Vespera. She leaned into his chest and felt the dominant energy coming off him. She purred as she rubbed her head into his chest. Lady Amaya blinked as the ninja around them all relaxed as they watched the show before them. Shanks watched with a smirk on his face, and Tsunade laughed a little as she sat on Shanks' lap. My, Lady Amaya, I guess your heir has taken a liking to my grandson. Lady Amaya hummed as she watched Vespera climb up onto Naruto's shoulder. Vespera rubbed her cheek on Naruto's whisker cheek. She also laughed a little as she saw the looks at the cubs she felt like would try to become the mate with her new summoner. Okay, everyone, we're here to meet our new summons and hand his swords to him. Vespera sat down on Naruto's shoulder with her body pressed against Naruto's head. The two armored tigers walked over, and Lady Amaya spoke as they sat down, their back facing Naruto. He looked at the two swords. On the right is Shisui. It has a black blade with a reddish-purple reverse wave, Hamon. It had a Kanemoto-like style, and its Tsuba has a flower-like edges in the shape of an octafoil. It also has no accessories on the hilt, just wrapped with black silk. Kashira, Tsuba, and Kojiri end cap are golden, and the sheath is black, decorated with dark red circles split into even thirds. Naruto grabbed Shisui and set it on his side before he drew the blade, and many of the Anbu got close to see the blade as well. They all thought the blade was beautiful, and a few wondered if they could find one like it. Naruto resheathed the Shisui and then grabbed Emna. Naruto stopped as he felt the sword pulse in his hand. He blinked, then put on Enma on top of Shisui. Black blade Enma. Enma has a black blade too, and was a moderately curved Shobu Zukuri-style katana. The Tsuba is trefoil-shaped, and each lobe is holed in the middle and thickly ridged. The Tsuka is lacquered solid lilac. But, at one time before behind blacked it forcefully pulled haki from the former users. Now, It will still forcibly take a large amount each time you use it, but the benefit is the power of your own haki will grow out of need to match the pull. Your bloodline will strengthen several fold. Now we must return home. I'm sure your grandfather and the former Haki King will explain the rest. All the tigers but Vespera disappeared. Shanks looked at her as she rubbed her head on Naruto's cheek. Vespera, your mother said to leave. Vespera hissed at Shanks, surprising him a little before she spoke. I'm the princess of the tigers. I come and go between the summon and human world as I choice. No, explain before I finish clawing out that eye. Shanks sighed and nodded his head, knowing a tiger never made an empty threat. Both are a masterpiece of the legendary swordsmith Shimotsuki Kozaburo and one of the 21 great grade swords. Enma and Shisui are among the best swords in the world. Kazuki Sukiyaki has described Enma as able to cut through to the bottom of hell. Paralleling Aim no Habakiri, its sister sword, being able to slice heaven itself. Kozaburo himself deemed Enma to be his best masterpiece in comparison. The ninja around them looking Naruto in amazement. Two of the most valuable swords in all of the elemental nations were just handed over to a teen. Academy 3rd POV. Vespera got up and stretched out as Ino and Yui left the room, with Vespera jumping onto the desk. Naruto moved his swords to the other side and grabbed Hinata's arm as she stood up. She effed before Naruto pulled her hard, pulled her into his lap, and wrapped his arm around her waist. Hinata blushed as she felt the muscles under Naruto's open shirt. But, not caring, she leaned back into Naruto's chest, overjoyed at the contact she'd been longing for. Naruto wrapped his other arm around her waist too. Hinata threw her arms back and interlocked her behind Naruto's neck. Naruto rested his head on Hinata's shoulder, and she could see a smile on his face. Hinata's smile crept back onto her face as joy filled her heart once again. Naruto-kun, what's going on with you? Naruto laughed as he rubbed her stomach. His smile dropped as he spoke. I was just sick of being smothered by the four of you. I thought if I made you four back off some you'd learn to just give me some breathing room. But, the last few months I've seen you and the others seem depressed. Especially you and Anko. Hinata unlocked her fingers and started to move around. Naruto led her waist, and Hinata turned and got on her knees and looked down at Naruto. Naruto blushed a little as he looked up at Hinata. Hinata blushed before she looked out the window, seeing nobody outside, then looked back at the door to see it was still closed. She smiled before she moved Vespera over a little. Vespera gave her a little growl, but she moved, knowing her friend was finally looking at the girl as a possible mate. Hinata sat down on the desk and grabbed Naruto's shirt, and pulled him onto his feet. Hinata. Hinata wrapped her legs around Naruto's waist, locking them in place as she opened to the top of her now slightly tight orange jacket. Naruto blushed as he saw wraps around Hinata's chest. Hinata laughed as she wrapped her arms around his neck again. Yeah, I've been hiding my real size. I just wanted to keep wearing this jacket hoping you'd come back around again. Naruto laughed a little before he smiled a little more and put his hands on Hinata's sides. He ran his hands up her side and wrapped his arm around her back. He smiled as he felt her soft long hair. He moved one hand around and ran his fingers through her hair. Hinata was in heaven at this moment. Her Naruto was holding her, and she was getting the private time she'd missed so much. Hinata looked into Naruto's eyes and saw a soft look in those eyes that had become so cold. Hinata moved her hands and placed them on Naruto's cheeks and ran her thumbs over his whisker marks. Naruto shivered, and Hinata smiled as she may have just found one of his sensitive spots. Hinata please stop. Hinata smiled as she felt his shiver as she played with his whisker marks. No Naruto-kun. You've been very cold to me over the last 6 months. Now, I'm taking the attention I've been wanting and you're going to be a good little fox and let me. Hinata moved one hand from his face and started to run it down his neck before the door slammed open. Naruto pulled Hinata into his chest as they both looked at the door. Hinata saw red when she looked at Kiba and Sasuke. I'm going to kill you too. You just interrupted my first private time in 6 months with my Naruto-kun. Hinata roared before she shoved Naruto back and grabbed Shisui's handle. Naruto held her for a second, trying to zip her jacket back up, and managed it before Hinata broke free and drew Shisui as she charged the two fools who'd interrupted them. I'm an Uchiha, you can't do this. Kiba's dog Akamaru barked before he jumped off Kiba's head, making a run for it. The two quickly followed as she screamed and cursed at them. Naruto sighed as he sat back down and tried to ignore the semi-hard-on in his pants. Naruto frowned at the fact they were all only 13, and she had all but him in the classroom. Then it hit Naruto that Hinata may really kill the two of them. Naruto quickly put Shisui's sheath on his side with Emna on the top again. Naruto grabbed Vespera as he started to run out of the classroom to try and save the fools. 10 minutes later, third POV. The clan heads laughed as they walked out of the Akamichi barbecue restaurant with Shanks, Tsunade, and Shizune in the back. Shanks looked at them with a raised eyebrow as he looked at them. Tsunade, Shizune, do you two really think things are possible? Tsunade smiled and nodded, wrapping her arm around Shanks's good arm. Yes, I have cells from my grandfather that were taken from one of Orochimaru's labs. I could construct a prosthetic limb with mobility and sensation as well. But I don't know how well your hockey would work with it. Shanks nodded before Tsunade smirked and pulled his arm into her more. Besides, I have some of my eggs frozen. Who knows, some more Uzumaki and Senju kids running around could be nice. Shanks nodded before he leaned down a little and gave Tsunade a small kiss before they all heard screaming. Everyone stopped and looked around before Akamaru ran past them with Kiba and Sasuke close behind. They watched the two panicking teens running. Behind them was the rage-filled eyes of Hinata as she swung Shisui at them as she chased them. Chasing behind her was Naruto, with Vespera clinging to his back as he yelled for Hinata to stop. Sum and Makoto looked on in shock as they watched their kids running away. Hiyashi watched in shock as Hinata screamed at them for running her moment with her Naruto-kun. Shanks burst out laughing as Naruto offered Hinata anything and everything if she stopped trying to kill the two idiots. Shizune la before she spoke up. With what we just saw, I think maybe they walk in on the two before they could have some fun. Hiyashi's and Shanks's faces turned white before they took off after the group. Tsunade laughed a little as she watched them running after them.